Hey there. Welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we're unraveling the story of a man who walked New York streets in a bathrobe, muttering to himself, looking like he'd lost his mind. His name? Vincent the Chin Gigante. Some knew him as the Oddfather. Others called him a genius in disguise. For decades, he fooled the FBI, judges, and even the public, all while secretly running the most powerful Mafia family in America. And then, just like that, the truth came out. Before we dive in, drop a comment below and let me know, where are you listening from right now, and what time is it for you? I love seeing this little family of ours stretch across countries and time zones. Oh, and if you're new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. That way you'll never miss the next dive into the underworld. So, take a breath, let the noise of the day fade out, and follow me into the shadows. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn. Under the dim glow of a New York street lamp, the man in the bathrobe shuffled forward, slippers scraping against the cracked pavement of Greenwich Village. His mouth moved in a constant murmur, words tumbling out in fragments, a stream of nonsense to anyone listening nearby. Sometimes he tilted his head toward the sky, as though he were carrying on a private conversation with ghosts only he could see. To the neighbors who caught glimpses of him at odd hours, he was the strange old man of Sullivan Street, pitiful at best, deranged at worst. To the federal agents sitting in idling cars just across the street, cameras aimed through rain-specked windshields, he was something else entirely. This was Vincent Gigante, the supposed boss of the Genovese crime family, and he'd been playing one of the longest, most infuriating games the FBI had ever witnessed. The question whispered from one agent to another as shutters clicked and notebooks filled with reports was simple. Had the most powerful mobster in America truly lost his mind, or was he running the greatest act the underworld had ever staged? The neighborhood itself felt like part of the theater. Greenwich Village was no stranger to eccentricity, its streets alive with musicians, poets, and night wanderers. Yet this figure in a sagging bathrobe and slippers seemed out of place even here. He would shuffle past store windows without looking in, cross against traffic while drivers leaned on their horns, and pause at corners to gesture vaguely at shadows. It was a performance that made even seasoned agents shift uncomfortably in their seats. More than once, one muttered to another that they were wasting government resources, chasing a lunatic. But then they would remember the wiretaps, the whispers from informants, the murders traced back to the Genovese family. The man who looked like a vagrant was said to be the hidden hand behind one of the most disciplined and feared criminal organizations in the world. The spectacle of Vincent's nightly walks became a paradox. To strangers, he appeared pitiable, a reminder of how age and illness could hollow out a once strong body. To those who knew his reputation, he was a phantom, present yet untouchable. When neighbors told reporters that they often saw him wandering aimlessly, the stories reinforced the myth. Judges were handed medical reports, psychiatrists debated his sanity, and every strange shuffle through the streets added weight to the defense he had built around himself. The act was working, and the line between performance and reality blurred so deeply that even some family members whispered questions about his state of mind. One agent, years later, recalled how he stared at Vincent through a telephoto lens and caught himself wondering if they were hunting the wrong man. It was like watching a ghost, he said. You almost wanted to believe he was harmless. But then you remember the bodies. For the FBI, those bodies mattered. Beneath the slippers and slurred speech was the prime suspect in racketeering, loan sharking, and contract killings. Gigante's control was whispered about in backrooms and social clubs. His word carried like scripture among soldiers and captains. Yet here he was, looking like a broken man wandering through the night. The power of the act came not just from its strangeness, but from its persistence. Anyone can fake madness for a day or two. But Vincent carried it for decades. Like a second skin he refused to shed. He shuffled not only through streets but into courtrooms, hospitals, and even family gatherings with the same vacant expression and muttered nonsense. It was a curtain drawn across his true self, leaving prosecutors and journalists to guess what lay behind. And behind that curtain, the Genovese family thrived. Gambling dens operated smoothly, construction rackets lined pockets, and rivals learned quickly that even if the boss looked like he had lost his mind, his reach was as sharp as ever. There was a cruel brilliance in the timing. The 1980s were years of spectacle and organized crime. John Gotti strutted through New York like a peacock in silk ties, cameras chasing him on every courthouse step. Other bosses flashed wealth, rolled dice in casinos, or spoke too loudly in bug rooms. Gigante moved in the opposite direction. He shrank himself, became a caricature of weakness, and in doing so avoided the spotlight. Where Gotti was called the Dapper Don, Gigante was dubbed the Oddfather. One invited fame, the other cloaked himself in ridicule. And as strange as it seemed, ridicule proved to be the stronger shield. Neighbors told stories of him, standing in doorways for hours, staring at nothing. Children giggled when they saw him, whispering that the crazy man was out again. Adults shook their heads and clucked their tongues in pity. Each tale spread through the village like seeds on the wind, reinforcing the legend that the once tough enforcer had collapsed into madness. Journalists scribbled, cameras rolled, and every photograph of him in that robe became another brick in the wall between him and justice. The FBI had evidence, but evidence meant nothing if a judge believed the accused could not even understand the charges. The effect on law enforcement was suffocating. Each time they thought they had a case, psychiatrists appeared with stacks of evaluations. Some swore he was unfit to stand trial. Others hesitated, unsure if they were being deceived. Trials were delayed, charges postponed, years slipping away while Gigante's empire grew fat. In private, agents raged. They knew what he was doing, but knowing and proving were two different worlds. And Vincent lived in the space between them, as untouchable as smoke. For those inside the Genovese family, the act was both protection and pressure. Soldiers spoke of their boss with reverence, yet they were careful to never mock his charade. To them, the bathrobe was armor, shielding their leader from the fate that had claimed so many others. But some admitted, quietly, that it also created distance. Orders came filtered through whispers, through captains who swore the boss was sharp as ever. And when doubts crept in, when the mask seemed too convincing even to his own men, those doubts were silenced with a reminder. Nobody rose higher than Vincent without reason. There was tragedy woven into the spectacle too. For his mother, who lived long enough to see her son parade through the streets like a broken man, the shame cut deep. She had once cheered his boxing matches, seen him stand tall and fierce in the ring. Now she watched him stumble in rags. Friends from his youth wondered aloud if crime itself had devoured him. And in whispered conversations at neighborhood cafes, the question lingered. Had Vincent fooled the world, or had the world fooled itself into believing in him? Each night he walked, the paradox deepened. Each night the FBI followed, their frustration mounting. They documented everything. The exact time he left home, the number of steps he took before turning back, the nonsense phrases he repeated. Reports stacked up like tombstones, and still no conviction came. Prosecutors argued over strategy, debating whether to pursue a man who might collapse on the witness stand. Judges worried about the optics of trying a man who looked like a patient from a hospital ward. And through it all, Vincent shuffled forward, his slippers whispering against the pavement like a clock ticking away the years. The genius of the act was that it required no words, no explanations. Silence and strangeness were his weapons. When he muttered, no one could parse meaning. When he stared into space, no one could guess his thoughts. He gave nothing that could be pinned down. It was like watching a magician who never revealed the trick, leaving the audience to argue among themselves while the show went on. The more absurd the performance, the more believable it became. And the more believable it became, the harder it was to dismantle in court. Yet even the most disciplined act carries cracks. Agents noted moments when the vacant stare sharpened, when his muttering fell silent as he stepped into a social club. There, behind closed doors, the shuffling ghost transformed into a calculating boss. They caught glimpses of the man behind the mask, brief, fleeting, but enough to keep their pursuit alive. Every time he vanished back into the bathrobe, they tightened their surveillance, waiting for the moment when the Oddfather would slip. By the mid-'80s, whispers spread beyond the village. Reporters began questioning whether the act was too perfect, too convenient. A few psychiatrists privately doubted their own evaluations, confessing that madness rarely carried itself with such consistency. Law enforcement redoubled efforts, planting bugs in clubs, pressing informants harder, following money trails. Beneath the image of a muttering old man, a vast empire pulsed, and they were determined to expose it. Still, the neighborhood watched the strange ritual unfold night after night, like a play that never ended. To some, he was a joke. To others, a tragedy. But to the FBI, he was a puzzle that refused to be solved. Each shuffle of his slippers mocked their efforts. Each muttered phrase taunted their reports. The robe, the slippers, the vacant eyes. All of it formed a shield more impenetrable than any bodyguard's wall. And behind that shield, a Mafia dynasty thrived. One winter evening, an agent snapped a photo of Vincent standing under a streetlight, snowflakes catching in his hair, his robe clinging damply to his shoulders. The image circulated among prosecutors, judges, and journalists. To some it looked like proof of decline, a sad portrait of a man lost to illness. To others, it was a symbol of defiance, a boss daring the world to call his bluff. The truth lay somewhere in between, hidden deep within the mind of the man himself. And so the question remained, unanswered and maddening. Was Vincent Gigante truly broken, or was he laughing at them all from behind the mask? The answer, the agents knew, would not come tonight, nor the next night, nor perhaps for years. But one day, the cracks in the performance would widen, and when they did, the truth would crawl into the light. Until then, the streets of Greenwich Village would echo with the soft scrape of slippers, the mutter of nonsense words, and the unshakable suspicion that the greatest trick the Mafia ever played was convincing the world that its most powerful boss was insane. And that is where the story begins. Under a streetlight, with a man in a bathrobe who looked like a ghost, and an empire hidden in plain sight. The slippers shuffle on, but behind the next corner waits the shadow of his past. A past soaked in blood, ambition, and betrayal. The bathrobe boss had not always been a ghost. Once, long before the act, he was a fighter, a soldier, a man with fists that carried the weight of destiny. And to understand the Oddfather, you must first meet the boy who would one day wear the robe. The smell of fresh bread mixed with the stench of coal smoke as the sun rose over Greenwich Village in the late 1920s. The streets were narrow, crooked veins of the city, alive with shouting vendors, clattering carts, and the cries of children who darted between stoops. Behind every tenement wall, immigrant families squeezed together, carrying the weight of old countries while struggling to carve a future in the new one. In one of those crowded apartments, in March of 1928, a boy named Vincent Gigante entered the world. Few could have guessed that this child, born into poverty and noise, would one day become the most cunning and perplexing figure the American Mafia had ever seen. Yet even in those earliest days, the streets themselves seemed to whisper his future. Life in Little Italy was both cradle and cage. The community provided comfort, yes, but also constant reminders of struggle. His parents were Italian immigrants who brought with them little more than language, faith, and a hope that hard work might keep food on the table. His father was a watchmaker, patient and precise, his hands shaping tiny gears that ticked out the hours of his family's survival. His mother, devout and tireless, poured her energy into raising 5 sons, clinging to the rituals of home to protect them from the rough edges of the streets. Poverty was not just an inconvenience. It was a daily companion. Every penny mattered. Every loaf of bread stretched further than it should have. Children learned quickly in such an environment. The streets were classrooms, unforgiving and relentless. Respect came not from school books, but from toughness, from how well you could defend yourself on the corner. For Vincent, the lessons came early. He was smaller than some, quieter than others, but there was a resilience in his eyes. He absorbed everything: the sharp words of his father, the hushed warnings of his mother, the rhythm of men in dark coats who lingered at cafe tables whispering names and promises. He may not have understood the full picture yet, but he could sense the power that hovered in the air whenever those men passed by. Fists became a language in Greenwich Village. When arguments broke out between boys in the alleys, when pride clashed with hunger, fists decided the truth faster than any words could. Vincent found his own voice in this language. By the time he reached his teenage years in the 1940s, boxing had become both outlet and escape. The sport was more than a game in New York then. It was a ladder. For poor kids of immigrant families, a boxing ring was one of the few places where discipline and courage could be converted into respect and, sometimes, money. Each punch thrown inside the ropes carried the hope of rising above the grind of tenement life. Vincent's talent with his fists set him apart. He moved with precision, with a determination that mirrored the patient hands of his father, but redirected into violence. Neighbors remembered him shadowboxing on stoops, practicing combinations as though preparing not only for fights in the gym, but for the battles of life itself. The nickname, the Chin, would come later, born from his mother's accented way of calling him Vincenzo, but in those early years he was just another hungry kid chasing a way out. Still, the ring gave him structure, something to cling to in a neighborhood where so many others were swallowed by aimless streets. Yet boxing alone could not shield him from the world outside the ropes. The same streets that honed his toughness also revealed another path, one lined not with sweat and applause, but with whispers of power and easy money. Men with names carried weight in the village, and that weight could lift or crush you. Vincent saw them lingering near corner clubs, exchanging nods, slipping envelopes into pockets. To outsiders, they might look like ordinary men. To those who lived there, their presence was heavy as iron. They controlled the flow of gambling, the promises of protection, the very rhythm of the neighborhood. For a boy like Vincent, the contrast was impossible to ignore. In the ring, a fight might earn him a few dollars. In the streets, a single errand for the right man could put more than that in his pocket with less sweat and more respect. Respect mattered more than anything. It was the currency of survival, the invisible line between being pushed aside and being protected. Slowly, quietly, the seeds of loyalty to the underworld were planted. Boxing built his fists, but the streets built his understanding of where true power lay. The tension inside the Gigante household reflected this dual path. His father clung to honesty, to work done with precision, believing that dignity came from steady labor, even if it never made you rich. His mother prayed over her sons, hoping to steer them away from temptation. But outside, temptation was everywhere. Poverty gnawed at their pride, and the streets offered shortcuts. To a boy growing into a young man, the lure of belonging, of being part of something larger than himself, was irresistible. His brothers would also find themselves pulled into similar orbits, some becoming professionals, one even turning to the church. But Vincent's gaze lingered on the men whose authority bent the neighborhood to their will. Greenwich Village in those years was a place of paradox. Musicians and artists mingled with mobsters and hustlers. Families raised children with hopes of a better tomorrow, while crime families plotted futures rooted in power and control. To live, there was to live inside a constant contradiction. Hope on one side, danger on the other. Vincent absorbed both sides like a sponge. He could hear his mother's prayers at night, yet the next morning watch as men slipped quietly into backrooms where deals were made. He learned early that survival meant adapting, knowing when to appear humble and when to bare your teeth. The boxing ring taught him discipline, but it was the street corners that sharpened his instincts. In fights, you could see your opponent's eyes, read their shoulders, time their punches. In the streets, the dangers were hidden, and reading them became an art. Vincent developed a sense for when to speak, when to keep silent, when to nod respectfully, and when to step aside. That instinct would become one of his greatest weapons later, the subtle ability to appear harmless while his mind calculated every angle. It is easy to romanticize such beginnings, to imagine the young Gigante as a scrappy underdog rising from poverty. But the reality was grittier. Hunger gnawed at the neighborhood. Tenement walls dripped with condensation in the winter, sweltered in the summer. Opportunities were scarce. Each day brought new challenges. Landlords demanding rent, police patrolling with suspicion, rival boys from other blocks ready to fight over nothing more than pride. Childhood in Greenwich Village was not innocence. It was preparation. And for Vincent, it was a preparation that would shape every step of his life. Still, beneath the hardness, there were glimpses of tenderness. Neighbors remembered him as quiet, almost shy compared to louder boys. He often walked with his head slightly lowered, as though listening more than speaking. He cared deeply for his mother, often running errands to ease her burden. Yet even these small acts of kindness existed in the shadow of something larger. The boy who carried bread home was the same boy who stayed out late, watching the movements of men who carried secrets. He straddled two worlds, the world of family duty and the world of street power. One demanded obedience, the other promised freedom. By the early 1940s, the choice between these worlds grew sharper. America itself was at war, sending young men overseas, and the city pulsed with both fear and opportunity. For some, the war meant escape from the streets. For others, it meant filling the void left behind. Organized crime thrived in those gaps, and the Genovese family extended its influence deeper into the village. Vincent was no longer just a boy in the background. His name was being whispered now, quietly, as someone with potential. The irony was sharp. While his fists earned him a reputation in the ring, it was his quiet loyalty outside it that drew notice. He was not reckless. He was not loud. He observed, learned, and obeyed. In a world where many young men were eager to prove themselves through flashy violence, Vincent's restraint stood out. He seemed to understand instinctively that true power did not shout. It whispered. That whisper, in time, would carry him into the inner circle of one of the most dangerous men in organized crime. But for now, in the waning years of the 1940s, he was still a young man of the village, caught between the watchful eyes of his parents and the beckoning nods of men who ruled the night. His story had only just begun, yet the outlines were already visible. The bathrobe boss of decades later was being shaped by tenement walls, by the sting of fists in the ring, by the lure of whispers on corners. Poverty and ambition danced together in him, each step pushing him closer to the path he would one day dominate. The village had given him everything: hardship, hunger, hope, and danger. It had tested him, hardened him, and planted in him a seed of cunning that would one day bloom into the most elaborate deception the Mafia had ever known. The boy who listened more than he spoke was preparing, whether he realized it or not, for a life where silence itself would become his sharpest weapon. And so the chapter of his childhood closes not with resolution, but with a lingering question. The young man who shadowboxed in alleys and studied the movements of men in backrooms stood at the edge of two worlds. One offered the honest labor of his father, the prayers of his mother. The other promised wealth, fear, and respect. Which path would he choose? The answer lay just ahead, waiting in the moment when his fists would collide with the underworld's outstretched hand. The crowd was restless that night, the smell of sweat and tobacco hanging thick in the small New York gym. The ring ropes creaked, the canvas darkened with stains of past battles, and a wiry young fighter stood in the corner, gloves raised, eyes locked on the man across from him. The boy was lean, not the most imposing figure in the room, but there was a steadiness in his stare. When the bell rang, he moved forward, fists snapping in quick combinations. Each punch was sharp, clean, deliberate, carrying more hunger than technique. The name on the fight card was Vincent Gigante, but the neighborhood already knew him by something else: the chin. The nickname had not been born in the ring, but at home, years earlier, from the lips of his mother. Her voice carried the thick, musical accent of her Italian tongue. When she called Vincenzo, It sounded like Chin Chenzo. Neighbors shortened it, friends teased it, and soon it became a badge. What began as a quirk of language grew into an identity, one that would follow him from the ring to the streets, from boyhood into the shadows of the underworld. Names mattered in the village. A name could be a crown or a curse. For Vincent, the Chin became both. Boxing, in those years, was more than a sport. It was a ticket. For poor kids from immigrant families, it was one of the few ways to climb out of the tenement basements and into a place where your fists could rewrite your story. The United States in the 1940s adored boxing. Champions were celebrated like kings, and even local club fighters could earn more in one night than their fathers did in a week. For Vincent, the ring was not just a dream. It was a chance to prove himself, to carve respect in a city that measured worth and toughness. He fought as an amateur first, stepping into gyms where the crowds were small but the scrutiny was sharp. There was no glamour in those fights, only the thud of leather and the sting of sweat in your eyes. He lost some, won others, but each bout hardened him. His record was not spectacular, but it was enough to make his name circulate. He carried himself with a quiet resolve, a seriousness that made older trainers take notice. They saw in him not only fists but discipline, the willingness to endure pain without flinching. When he turned professional, the battles grew harder. Every opponent was hungry, every punch a test. The Chin stood his ground, enduring flurries, landing counters, building a reputation as someone who would not fold easily. His professional career would count 24 fights, a mixture of victories and defeats, but in each one he learned lessons that would outlast the ring. He learned how to mask pain, how to keep his expression calm, even when a punch rattled his skull. He learned patience, waiting for an opening rather than rushing blindly. And he learned how to take hits without showing weakness. Those lessons would follow him long after the gloves came off. The money was modest, never enough to transform his family's life, but it was more than what most boys on the block could dream of. Each envelope of cash handed to him after a fight felt like validation, a sign that his fist could command something tangible. His parents were proud, even if worried. His father admired the discipline, the work ethic. His mother, ever anxious, prayed with each fight that her son would come home unbroken. She had not raised a gangster or a fighter in her heart. She had raised a son, and watching him trade blows under hot gym lights filled her with equal parts pride and dread. But boxing alone could not satisfy the hunger that burned inside him. The victories brought cheers, yes, but the cheers faded quickly. What lingered was the realization that no matter how hard he trained, no matter how many punches he landed, the path of a boxer was uncertain. One bad fight, one wrong step, and the dream could vanish. He saw other fighters, older, broken by the sport, their bodies scarred, their pockets empty. For Vincent, boxing was a proving ground, but it was not the final destination. It was a tool, a stage where he sharpened the traits that would serve him in another arena. In many ways, the ring mirrored the streets. The way you circled an opponent was not so different from the way you circled an opportunity. The way you hid your pain after a heavy blow was not so different from hiding fear in front of dangerous men. Vincent carried these parallels with him. Boxing had taught him how to endure, how to measure risk, how to project strength even when you were close to collapse. These lessons would become the foundation of the mask he would later wear, the act of weakness that concealed his truth. He fought with heart, but his record was unremarkable, and the sport's promise of escape dimmed with each fight. There were whispers already in the neighborhood that Vincent was being noticed by men whose power extended far beyond the ropes. They watched him fight, admired his toughness, but cared less about the scorecards than about the discipline in his eyes. He had proven he could take punishment, follow orders, and never show weakness. These were qualities that mattered far more in their world than a belt or a trophy. As his boxing career wound down, the nickname stuck harder than ever. The Chin had become more than a name. It was a persona, a shorthand for resilience. In the ring, it meant a jaw that could absorb blows. On the street, it meant a presence that could not be ignored. Neighbors knew him as a fighter, a kid who had tested himself under the lights. But soon, they would know him for something else. In the quiet after his last fights, as he walked through the village with his gloves slung over his shoulder, the crossroads became clear. He could remain a fighter, chasing modest paydays, risking his health for uncertain glory. Or he could turn toward the men who already had their eyes on him, men who offered more than cash. They offered belonging, power, and respect. To a young man raised in the hunger of tenement life, the choice began to feel less like a decision and more like destiny. And so the boxer's gloves began to gather dust. The discipline, the patience, the ability to mask pain. He carried all of it with him, but now into a world where the punches came in whispers, orders, and shadows. The boy called Chin by his mother had tested his fists against other fighters. Now he would test his loyalty against men who measured worth in silence, secrecy, and blood. The crowd's cheers faded into memory. The ring lights dimmed. But the lessons of those 24 fights never left him. They hardened his jaw, sharpened his resolve, and gave him the mask he would wear for the rest of his life. In the ring, he had learned to play hurt, to disguise weakness. In the years to come, he would take that lesson and turn it into a weapon powerful enough to fool the entire justice system. But before that transformation could take place, another man would step into his life, a mentor who would shape his path, pull him deeper into the world of organized crime, and place him at the center of a story that would change the Mafia forever. The gloves were off, but the real fight was only beginning. The sound of a car door slamming echoed down Sullivan Street, one humid evening in the late 1940s. A man in a dark suit stepped out, his shoes polished, his eyes sharp. He wasn't from the block, but everyone who lingered near the corner cafe straightened up as he passed. Respect traveled faster than footsteps. Kids stopped tossing a ball. Old men fell silent over their espresso. And leaning against the stoop, watching with careful eyes, was Vincent Gigante. He had fought in the ring, tested himself under the hot gym lights. But here on the streets of Greenwich Village, he was about to learn a different kind of fight. One where fists were less important than silence, loyalty, and knowing exactly when to act. It didn't happen all at once. Vincent didn't wake up one morning and decide he was finished with boxing and ready to join the mob. The transition was more like a slow drift, a current pulling him deeper without him even realizing how far he'd gone. It began with small favors, the kind of errands young men in the neighborhood often took on without asking too many questions. Deliver this envelope. Watch that doorway. Carry this bag across town. On the surface, they seem harmless, but each errand carried weight, a test of obedience, a measure of trust. And Vincent, quiet, disciplined, and reliable, passed those tests with ease. The men who gave him these jobs were connected to the Genovese crew, one of the most powerful mafia families in New York. They had roots as deep as the cobblestones, their influence stretching from gambling dens to construction sites, from street corners to political offices. To ordinary people, they were shadows, always present, rarely acknowledged. To those growing up in their neighborhoods, they were both fear and opportunity. Vincent had seen them his whole life, men who never seemed to wait in line, who never had to raise their voices to command respect. They carried themselves with a quiet authority, and even as a boy, he had understood that authority meant safety. Now, as a young man, he found himself inching closer to their circle. For Vincent, the lessons from boxing translated seamlessly to this new world. In the ring, you learn when to strike and when to hold back, when to endure pain without showing weakness. On the street, the rules were the same. He knew how to keep his head down, how to let others underestimate him, how to endure without complaint. The men of the Genovese family admired that restraint. They didn't need hotheads. They needed soldiers, men who could take orders, keep quiet, and disappear into the background until needed. Vincent fit the mold. His loyalty, even in those early days, was not just about money. Poverty had carved hunger into him. Yes, but it wasn't only hunger for cash. It was hunger for belonging, for the kind of respect that boxing crowds never fully gave him. In the ring, applause faded. On the streets, respect lingered. When he carried an envelope across the village, he wasn't just a kid running errands. He was part of something larger, something whispered about in alleys and feared by outsiders. That sense of purpose dug deep into him, anchoring him to the men he served. But with loyalty came risk. Every errand carried the possibility of danger. A police officer might stop you, ask questions. A rival crew might see you, mark your face. In the world Vincent was stepping into, danger wasn't loud and sudden like a punch in the ring. It was quiet, creeping, the kind that sat heavy on your shoulders long after the job was done. He felt it even then, the weight of secrets pressing down on him. And yet, the more he carried, the more he proved himself. The Genovese crew noticed. Among them was a man whose name carried enormous weight, Vito Genovese. He was feared, respected, and ruthless, a man who understood the value of loyalty better than most. Vincent's quiet discipline caught his eye. In a world full of ambitious young men trying to prove themselves with noise, Vincent's silence spoke louder. He wasn't trying to outshine anyone. He wasn't reckless. He did what was asked and nothing more. That quality was rare, and it made him valuable. Still, the transition from fighter to soldier was not without conflict. His family worried. His father wanted him to pursue honest work, to use his discipline in a trade. His mother prayed harder, sensing the pull of shadows around her son. But Vincent's course was already shifting. Once you begin taking orders from men like the Genovese crew, turning back becomes almost impossible. The streets don't forgive hesitation. The first favor leads to the second, and before long, you're no longer just a boy running errands. You're the man they can count on when something heavier needs doing. In the village, everyone knew who was connected and who wasn't. Being connected didn't just mean carrying a gun or running rackets. It meant being part of an invisible shield, a protection that separated insiders from outsiders. For Vincent, the early steps into that world felt like stepping out of the fragile uncertainty of boxing and into something solid. The cheers of fight crowds had been fleeting, but the nod of respect from a made man, that was permanent. That was currency you could spend for the rest of your life. By the early 1950s, Vincent's place as a street soldier was becoming clear. He still carried himself with the quiet air of the boxer he had once been, but now his fists served a different purpose. Violence in the mob was never random. It was calculated, precise, like a combination thrown at just the right moment. He learned when to intimidate and when to stay invisible, when to use his hands and when to let silence do the work. That balance made him stand out. He wasn't reckless muscle. He was something more dangerous, a man who understood patience. The streets of Greenwich Village were changing, too. War veterans returned home, new immigrants crowded into tenements, and the underworld's grip grew tighter. Gambling dens hummed late into the night. Loan sharks prowled for desperate men. Politicians whispered with mobsters in backrooms. It was a world where money and power flowed together like currents in the Hudson River. To survive in that current, you needed allies. Vincent found his in the Genovese family. They gave him protection, opportunity, and direction. In return, he gave them his silence, his loyalty, and his fists. What set him apart, even then, was his ability to fade into the background. Other young men tried to build reputations, to show off their toughness. Vincent did the opposite. He let people underestimate him, let them dismiss him as quiet, unremarkable. It was the same lesson he had learned in the ring. Don't show your pain. Don't reveal your hand. That invisibility became his greatest strength. Few outside the crew even noticed how deeply he was sinking into the underworld's grip. But behind the calm exterior, ambition stirred. He might not have shown it, but Vincent understood where these small errands were leading. Each envelope, each whispered message, each night spent outside a social club instead of in a boxing gym, it was all a path that led deeper into power, deeper into danger, and closer to the man whose shadow loomed over the entire family, Vito Genovese himself. The young fighter who had once dreamed of titles was gone. In his place stood a street soldier, sharpening himself for battles not fought under gym lights, but in alleys, social clubs, and courtrooms. His gloves had been traded for whispers, his ring for the neighborhood streets. And while no one watching him that evening on Sullivan Street could have predicted it, those quiet steps were carrying him toward a destiny that would one day make him the most elusive mob boss in America. For now, though, he was still proving himself, still running errands, still showing the crew that he could be trusted. The tests were growing harder, the risks sharper. The boy called Chin was about to cross another line, one that would tie him forever to the Genovese family. Because the errands of a street soldier were only the beginning. The real test of loyalty was coming. The kind of test where failure wasn't an option, and hesitation could cost you more than respect. It could cost you your life. The night air was heavy with cigarette smoke and whispers when Vincent first stepped into the back room where Vito Genovese held court. It was not a grand office or a polished boardroom. It was a dimly lit social club in Greenwich Village, its walls yellowed with years of smoke, its tables scarred by restless hands. But in that room, power moved like an invisible current. Men leaned in close, their voices low, every word measured. At the center of it sat Vito, his presence filling the room without him ever needing to raise his voice. When his eyes fixed on Vincent, the young street soldier felt both exposed and chosen. It was a moment that would change everything. Vito Genovese was no ordinary boss. He was ruthless, cunning, and ambitious. A man who had clawed his way to the top of the Mafia hierarchy with a mix of violence and cold calculation. He had little patience for recklessness, no tolerance for betrayal. To serve him was to walk a razor's edge, but it was also an opportunity. For Vincent, it meant stepping out of the role of errand boy and into something larger. The older man saw something in him, something that went beyond fists and silence. He saw potential. The first thing that drew Vito's attention was loyalty. In the underworld, loyalty was currency, more valuable than money, more reliable than muscle. A man who could be trusted was worth more than a dozen who could throw punches. Vincent had already proven himself in small ways, keeping his mouth shut when questioned, delivering messages without error, obeying orders without complaint. To outsiders, these might have seemed like trivial acts. To men like Vito, they were everything. Each small task, completed without hesitation, was a brick in the foundation of trust. But loyalty alone wasn't enough. Vito had plenty of men willing to follow orders. What made Vincent stand out was his toughness. Not just physical toughness, though his boxing days had shown he could take a hit and keep moving, but emotional toughness. He didn't panic under pressure. He didn't brag or boast. He absorbed pressure like a stone absorbs rain, quietly, without breaking. In a world where loose talk could mean death, that kind of resilience was rare. Vito recognized it, and he decided to shape it. Becoming a protege of someone like Genovese wasn't a formal ceremony. There were no announcements, no titles handed out. It was a slow process, a gradual deepening of responsibility. One day you were carrying envelopes, the next you were standing watch outside a meeting, and before long you were being trusted with matters that carried real weight. Vincent felt a shift in subtle ways. Men began treating him differently, their nods carrying respect rather than dismissal. When he walked into a room, people noticed, not because he was loud, but because his presence carried the shadow of Vito's approval. The older boss began to test him in new ways. These weren't fights in a ring, where punches came fast and obvious. These were tests of judgment. Could Vincent keep calm when faced with an angry rival? Could he enforce discipline without drawing unnecessary attention from the police? Could he deliver a message that carried not only words, but the weight of threat behind them? Each test was designed to sharpen him, to reveal whether he had the instincts required to climb higher. And time after time, he proved himself. One story whispered through the neighborhood spoke of Vincent being sent to collect from a stubborn gambler who had fallen behind on payments. Many young men might have gone in fists first, eager to prove their strength. Vincent chose patience. He listened, spoke quietly, let the man feel the pressure of silence more than the threat of violence. When he finally acted, it was swift, controlled, just enough to make the message clear. The gambler paid. More importantly, Vito heard how it was handled and nodded in approval. It wasn't the size of the act that mattered. It was the discipline behind it. In time, Vito began pulling him closer, inviting him into meetings where decisions were made. For a young man from the village, these gatherings were revelations. He saw how power truly worked, not through shouting or displays of wealth, but through calm discussions where lives and fortunes were decided with the wave of a hand. Sitting quietly in the corner, Vincent absorbed everything. He learned how alliances were forged, how enemies were outmaneuvered, how silence could be more intimidating than a gun. He watched Vito, not just as a boss, but as a teacher, a man who had mastered the art of control. That mentorship shaped him in profound ways. Vito was not a flashy leader. He preferred shadows, avoiding the limelight, letting others draw attention while he pulled the strings. Vincent took that lesson to heart. Years later, when other mob bosses craved headlines and paraded in tailored suits, Vincent would choose bathrobes and mutter nonsense. It was an evolution of the very lesson Vito had instilled. The less the world sees, the safer you are. But being close to a man like Genovese also meant inheriting his enemies. Vito had no shortage of rivals, men who wanted his power, who resented his rise. For Vincent, this meant danger was no longer a distant possibility. It was a daily reality. He had stepped into a circle where betrayal was always one handshake away, where a smile could hide a dagger. He learned to read faces the way a boxer reads an opponent's stance, searching for the faintest twitch that might reveal intent. In this world, survival was about anticipation. There were moments of fear, of course. No young man could sit across from killers and not feel a chill. But Vincent mastered the art of masking it. He kept his expression calm, his voice low, his movements deliberate. If fear lived inside him, it stayed locked away, hidden beneath the same patience that had carried him through the ring. This ability to appear unshaken would become his hallmark, the mask he would wear for the rest of his life. As the years passed, the bond between master and protege grew stronger. Vito entrusted him with more responsibility, and Vincent's name began to circulate beyond the village. He was no longer just a quiet kid who ran errands. He was becoming an enforcer, someone whose loyalty was unquestioned, whose toughness was proven. In Mafia terms, an enforcer is more than muscle. He is the arm of the boss, the one who carries out decisions that cannot be spoken in daylight. It is a role that requires not only strength, but absolute discretion. Vincent filled it with chilling efficiency. Every step deeper into Vito's world pulled him further from the life his parents had imagined. His father still tinkered with watches, each tiny gear a symbol of order and precision. His mother still lit candles, whispering prayers for her son's safety. But outside their door, Vincent was shaping himself into something neither of them could fully understand. The boxer they had raised had become a soldier of shadows, tied to a man whose ambition knew no limits. Yet, even in this ascent, uncertainty lingered. To be close to Vito was both blessing and curse. It meant protection, opportunity, power, but also meant exposure. The closer you stood to the sun, the more likely you were to burn. Vincent was still young, still learning, but he could already sense the danger. He had tied his fate to a man whose name inspired fear across New York, and that connection would shape the rest of his life. The lessons of loyalty and toughness had carried him this far. But the next test will be different. It would not be about envelopes or whispered threats. It would not be about sitting quietly in the corner of a smoky room. It would be about violence, about proving not just obedience, but absolute devotion. Vito would ask for something bigger, something that would mark Vincent forever. And when that order came, it would thrust him into one of the most infamous moments in Mafia history. A moment when the quiet street soldier would step fully into the role of trusted enforcer, and the name The Chin would no longer just echo from his mother's lips. It would be written in blood. The night of May 2nd, 1957, was quiet in Manhattan. Frank Costello, the man known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld, stepped out of a cab and walked toward the lobby of his apartment building on Central Park West. Costello had spent decades building influence, his power stretching from gambling parlors to the highest political offices. He was older now, grayer, worn down by years of backroom deals, but he still carried himself with the dignity of a man who had once held New York in the palm of his hand. What he didn't know was that a young enforcer named Vincent Gigante was waiting in the shadows, clutching a pistol, preparing to carry out one of the most infamous hits in Mafia history. The order had come from Vito Genovese. For years, Genovese had resented Costello's position as boss of the Luciano family, the man who held the crown that Genovese believed should have been his. Costello was respected, even admired, for his political connections and his calm leadership. But in the brutal arithmetic of organized crime, respect was never enough. Ambition demanded blood. Genovese wanted the throne, and to seize it, he needed Costello removed. The task fell to his loyal protege, Vincent, the Chin Gigante. For Vincent, this was no small assignment. It was a defining moment, a test that would cement his place in the underworld or end his life in disgrace. The transition from errand boy to soldier had been slow and deliberate. But this was something different. This was no envelope, no whispered threat. This was murder, ordered by a man whose word was law. To refuse would be unthinkable. To fail would be deadly. Costello entered the lobby that evening, the marble floors echoing under his footsteps. Behind him, Vincent emerged from the shadows, heart pounding, pistol in hand. He raised the weapon and fired. The bullet grazed Costello's head, carving a bloody groove across his scalp. The impact spun him, dropping him to the floor. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Costello's hands clutched his head, blood spilling between his fingers. Vincent stood there, frozen himself, caught between triumph and shock. He had pulled the trigger, but his target was still breathing. The sound of the shot reverberated through the building, and panic erupted. Costello staggered, dazed, but not broken. Somehow, against all odds, he survived. The bullet had missed its mark by inches, sparing his life but forever altering the course of Mafia history. For Vincent, it was both failure and success. He hadn't killed Costello, but he had delivered a message. The message was clear. The old order was crumbling, and Genovese was ready to claim his place. When police questioned Costello later, he famously muttered that he didn't know who had shot him, and he didn't want to know. It was the code of silence, omerta, in action. Even as blood trickled down his face, Costello refused to name names. But deep inside, he understood the truth. His reign was over. The bullet that grazed his head had done more than wound him physically. It had shattered his will to continue. Within days, he stepped aside, handing Genovese the power he had coveted for years. For Vincent, the attempt was enough. Genovese was satisfied, and Vincent's loyalty was proven in blood. In the twisted logic of the Mafia, even an imperfect hit could be considered a success if it achieved its purpose. Costello had survived, but his retirement cleared the path. Genovese became boss, and Vincent was now known as the man who had pulled the trigger. His name carried new weight, whispered with both respect and fear. Yet the attempt left scars, not just on Costello's head, but on Vincent's conscience. Those who knew him later said that he was shaken by the shooting. He was young, still in his 20s, and the reality of nearly taking a man's life lingered with him. He had proven his loyalty, but he had also crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The boxer who once fought for glory in the ring was now an enforcer marked by blood. His hands, once trained for sport, were now tools of death. Law enforcement saw the incident as confirmation of Genovese's ambition and Vincent's rising role. But proving it in court was another matter. Costello refused to cooperate, and without his testimony, the case against Vincent collapsed. In the end, Gigante walked free, his reputation intact, his bond with Genovese stronger than ever. The attempted assassination became a legend, a story whispered in smoky backrooms, a reminder that even survival could feel like defeat. For Costello, the shooting was the end of an era. He withdrew from the Mafia life, retreating into quiet obscurity. For Genovese, It was the beginning of his reign as boss of what would soon be called the Genovese crime family. And for Vincent, it was the turning point that transformed him from a soldier into a trusted enforcer, a man whose loyalty and toughness had been proven in the most brutal way imaginable. But surviving in the Mafia meant living with uncertainty. Every act of violence created ripples, and every ripple could grow into a wave. Vincent had pulled the trigger once. The question now was how many more times he would be asked to do it, and whether he would always walk away free. That night in 1957 became the moment when the world first began to recognize the name, the Chin. It was no longer just a nickname given by his mother, no longer just a moniker of a boxer. It was the name of a man who had nearly killed one of the most powerful bosses in New York. It was the name of a man who had proven his loyalty to Vito Genovese beyond all doubt. Yet even as his star rose, shadows gathered. For in the world of organized crime, power was never permanent. The throne Genovese had seized would not remain steady forever, and the protege who had carried out the hit would soon find himself entangled in the dangerous games of betrayal, survival, and deception that defined the Mafia at its core. The bullet had missed its mark, but it had set Vincent Gigante on a path that would define the rest of his life. A path that would lead him deeper into blood, deeper into shadows, and eventually into the most elaborate performance the Mafia had ever seen. The bathrobe and the muttered nonsense still lay far in the future. For now, Vincent was the young enforcer who had stepped out of the shadows with a gun in his hand, and the world would never forget it. But behind the applause of his peers and the approval of Genovese, a quiet question lingered in Vincent's mind. What price would he one day pay for being the man who pulled the trigger? The sound of the gavel striking would echo through the courtroom in 1959, and with it, the reign of Vito Genovese seemed to shudder. The once mighty boss, who had clawed his way to power through blood and ambition, was being sentenced to 15 years in federal prison on narcotics charges. Reporters scribbled furiously, photographers snapped their shutters, and whispers rippled through the underworld. For the government, it was a victory. For the Mafia, it was another reminder that even kings could fall. But for Vincent Gigante, the young soldier who had once stood in Vito's shadow, it was something else entirely, a test of loyalty, and an opening into a future that neither he nor his enemies could yet imagine. Only 2 years earlier, the attempted assassination of Frank Costello had changed the landscape. Costello stepped aside, Genovese took the throne, and the balance of power in New York tilted. The Genovese family became the most dominant crime syndicate in the country, controlling rackets that stretched from gambling to labor unions, from construction to narcotics. At the center of it all was Vito, commanding with an iron grip. And just behind him, always careful, always silent, was Vincent the Chin Gigante. In those days, the streets of Greenwich Village felt charged with tension. Every cafe, every corner bar, every social club carried the weight of whispered loyalties. Men who had once bowed to Costello now pledged themselves to Genovese. Others shifted uneasily, waiting to see how the winds of power would settle. For Vincent, there was no hesitation. His loyalty to Vito was absolute. The man who had plucked him from obscurity, who had trusted him with the most dangerous of tasks, was the man he would follow into fire. The family's power was expanding quickly. With Costello out of the way, Genovese wasted no time consolidating control. He tightened his grip on the docks, where longshoremen moved shipments both legal and illicit. He strengthened his reach into the unions, using them as both shield and weapon. He built alliances with other families, while at the same time undermining those who might challenge him. It was a chess game played on the streets of New York, and Vincent was one of his most trusted pieces. As an enforcer, Vincent's role grew sharper. He was no longer simply the young man eager to prove himself. He was now a figure whose presence carried weight, whose silence could chill a room. When he walked into a social club, conversations shifted. When he leaned close to deliver a message, men listened. The bullet he had fired at Costello had elevated him in ways words never could. He had shown not just loyalty, but courage, the willingness to risk everything for the family. And in the Mafia, that kind of devotion was rewarded. But power in the underworld is never secure. Even as Genovese strengthened his empire, the government circled. The narcotics trade, lucrative and deadly, became the wedge prosecutors used to pry open the family's secrets. Agents tracked shipments, flipped low-level dealers, built cases brick by brick. In 1959, they struck. Vito was convicted, and the man who had once ruled the city from the shadows was led away in handcuffs. For many, it seemed the end of an era. Yet the Genovese family did not crumble. It adapted. That was its greatest strength. Unlike other families, where flamboyant bosses brought heat with flashy suits and loud declarations, the Genovese operated like a machine, disciplined, quiet, structured. With Vito in prison, the leadership shifted into a kind of committee, captains guiding the day-to-day operations while still deferring to the man behind bars. And in this transition, Vincent's star continued to rise. He had built his reputation on toughness and loyalty, but now he was learning something more: patience. The prison bars around Genovese might have limited his movements, but his influence remained. Messages filtered out, orders whispered through trusted channels. Vincent was often part of those channels, carrying out instructions with the same precision that had once defined his boxing footwork. Each task completed without error deepened his reputation as reliable, as indispensable. The irony was striking. Where other young men in the family sought fame, basking in their notoriety, Vincent seemed to shrink from attention. He didn't crave headlines. He didn't dress in silk suits or pose for photographers. Instead, he perfected the art of invisibility. He let others talk, let others draw eyes, while he worked silently, methodically, like a shadow at the edge of every frame. It was a lesson he had learned from Vito himself. True power is quiet. The more the world underestimates you, the more dangerous you become. For the FBI, the imprisonment of Genovese was supposed to be a blow to the family. Yet what they saw instead was its resilience. The machine kept turning, its gears oiled by men like Vincent. Investigators grew frustrated. Each time they tried to pin something on him, he slipped away. Witnesses refused to talk. Cases collapsed. The man who had once been photographed in a boxing ring was now a ghost. His name whispered, but rarely attached to hard evidence. In the neighborhood, whispers about his rise carried both admiration and fear. Some saw him as the perfect soldier, the embodiment of Mafia discipline. Others viewed him as a reminder of how dangerous quiet men could be. He wasn't the type to make speeches or flaunt wealth, but when his name came up, voices lowered. Everyone knew what he was capable of, even if at home, his family life remained a paradox. To his mother, he was still her son, the boy she prayed for every night. To his father, he was still the boy who had once dreamed of an honest life. But to the world outside, he was no longer a boy at all. He was a man climbing steadily through the ranks of an empire built on fear, money, and silence. The imprisonment of Genovese changed the structure of the family, but it didn't change Vincent's path. If anything, it sharpened it. Without Vito physically present, trusted men like Vincent had more space to maneuver, more opportunities to prove their worth. Each decision, each carefully executed task, carried him closer to the inner circle. But with power came pressure. The FBI was watching more closely than ever. Rival families were circling, testing the Genovese defenses. And within his own ranks, ambition smoldered. In the Mafia, loyalty was everything. But it was also fragile. A man who was your ally today could be your betrayer tomorrow. Vincent knew this, and it fueled his careful, cautious nature. He would never be the flamboyant type, never the one to draw fire. Instead, he learned to disappear, to let the world see only what he wanted it to see. The streets of New York in the 1960s were shifting. The city pulsed with change, civil rights protests, rising crime, political upheaval. But beneath the noise, the Mafia remained steady, a shadow government of its own, controlling unions, influencing elections, moving money with invisible hands. Vincent moved with it, carving out his place, always careful, always silent. The boy who had once run errands for men in the village was now one of those men himself, feared and respected. His loyalty to Vito had carried him through the storm of the power shift, and his discipline had set him apart in a world where recklessness often led to early graves. Yet even as he grew in power, something else began to stir inside him, a seed of an idea, a strategy that would one day become his greatest weapon. He had seen how prison had failed to break Genovese, how silence and shadows had preserved his influence even behind bars. And Vincent began to wonder, what if invisibility could be pushed further? What if the greatest shield of all was not just silence, but madness itself? That thought would linger, waiting in the corners of his mind. For now, he was the loyal soldier, the quiet enforcer, the rising star of the Genovese family. But soon, he would step into a role that no one could have predicted. The power shift had secured his place. The next move would redefine his legacy. And in the dim light of social clubs and whispered conversations, the young man known as the Chin was already rehearsing the performance that would one day fool the world. On a gray morning in the late 1960s, a strange figure shuffled down Sullivan Street. His robe was faded, his slippers torn, and his muttering drifted through the air like broken pieces of a song. Passers-by slowed to stare, shaking their heads, some laughing, others pitying. To them, he was just a neighborhood oddball, a man undone by life. But to the federal agents watching from unmarked cars, notebooks ready, this was Vincent the Chin Gigante, a man suspected of running rackets and enforcing orders for the Genovese crime family. The question gnawed at them as they scribbled observations. Was he truly insane, or was he performing the most audacious act the Mafia had ever seen? The transformation didn't happen overnight. For years, Vincent had been a soldier, careful and disciplined, building his reputation in silence. But the scrutiny of law enforcement was tightening. The government was no longer content with chasing small-time gangsters. It wanted bosses, lieutenants, the men who pulled the strings. Wiretaps grew more sophisticated. Surveillance deepened. Courtrooms buzzed with prosecutors eager to make names for themselves. For a man like Vincent, survival demanded something extraordinary, something no one would expect. And so the act began. At first, it was subtle, slurred words, vacant stares, long pauses as though his thoughts were stuck in quicksand. Doctors were called, reports written. Some concluded he was fragile, suffering from mental illness that left him unfit for trial. Judges took the papers seriously, wary of putting a broken man on the stand. What started as a faint smokescreen soon became a curtain. Vincent leaned into it, perfecting the role until it was seamless. By the early 1970s, the performance had become infamous. Neighbors in Greenwich Village often saw him wandering in his robe, muttering nonsense, looking like a man lost in his own fog. Sometimes he would stand motionless at a street corner, staring at nothing for minutes at a time. Other times, he would stumble into traffic, causing horns to blare, drivers to curse, and pedestrians to laugh at the strange man in slippers. Each appearance reinforced the myth. The Oddfather, they whispered. The man who had once been feared was now pitted. But behind closed doors, the truth was sharper. In backrooms and social clubs, Vincent remained calculating. He listened carefully, gave orders with quiet authority, and managed his crew with the same discipline he had always shown. It was a dual existence. On the streets, a shell of a man. In the underworld, a hidden hand still pulling strings. His robe and slippers became armor, shielding him from the gaze of the law in ways no gun ever could. The brilliance of the act lay in its consistency. Madness is difficult to fake, not for a day or a week, but for years. Yet Vincent committed fully. He let doctors examine him, let psychiatrists scribble their notes as he stumbled through interviews. He slurred his speech, answered questions with gibberish, stared blankly when asked about his role in the family. Each time, medical records piled up, testifying to his supposed illness. The more paperwork there was, the harder it became for prosecutors to pierce the illusion. For law enforcement, the frustration was suffocating. Agents would watch him in the morning, wandering the streets like a ghost, and then hear whispers by night that he was attending meetings, making decisions, guiding the Genovese family with a steady hand. But whispers were not evidence. In court, what mattered were documents, testimony, proof, and the documents declared him unfit. The testimony of doctors painted him as incapable of understanding charges. Proof slipped through their fingers like smoke. The act also created distance between him and the flamboyance of other bosses. While John Gotti would one day become the dapper Don, dressing in fine suits and reveling in attention, Vincent chose invisibility. His disguise was ridicule. Who would believe that a man muttering in the streets, clad in a bathrobe, was one of the most powerful gangsters in America? The more absurd he appeared, the safer he became. In a world where power usually shouted, Vincent survived by whispering nonsense. Neighbors grew accustomed to the spectacle. Children pointed and laughed, calling him crazy. Adults shook their heads, whispering about how far he had fallen. To most, he was no threat, just a sad figure drifting through the village. But those who truly knew understood. The robe was a costume, the muttering was a script, and the man inside was sharper than ever, playing a role to perfection. The toll on his family was complicated. His mother, devout and loyal, hated to see her son mocked, even if she sensed there was more to it than met the eye. His brothers, each in their own way tied to religion, law, or community, walked a line between protecting him and questioning the deception. But loyalty ran deep in the Gigante family, and none betrayed his secret. The act was sustained not only by Vincent's commitment, but by the silence of those around him. For the Mafia itself, the Oddfather persona was a gift. While other families saw their bosses paraded through headlines and shackled in courtrooms, the Genovese had a leader who seemed untouchable. Trials stalled. Charges evaporated. Years slipped by. The family grew richer, stronger, all under the guidance of a man the courts declared too sick to stand trial. It was an irony that even law enforcement couldn't ignore. The most disciplined crime family in America was being led by a man everyone claimed was incapable of tying his own shoes. But beneath the humor lay danger. The act may have shielded Vincent from the law, but it also made him unpredictable in the eyes of rivals. Was he truly broken, or was all a mask? Men who crossed him found out quickly enough. His reputation for discipline didn't vanish with the robe. Orders were still carried out. Debts were still collected. Enemies still disappeared. The Oddfather might have looked harmless in the daylight, but by night, his reach remained lethal. Prosecutors grew desperate. Some tried to challenge the doctors, calling in their own experts. But madness is a slippery concept, and Vincent had perfected its performance. He mixed fragments of truth with lies, muddling every attempt to pin him down. One moment he seemed lost, the next oddly lucid, just enough to leave psychiatrists questioning themselves. It was a game of mirrors, and he was always one step ahead. The brilliance of the scheme was its patience. Most cons collapse under their own weight. A man slips, grows careless, reveals too much. But Vincent understood the value of repetition. Year after year, he shuffled the streets, muttered nonsense, built layer upon layer of medical evidence. The longer it went on, the more believable it became. By the mid-1970s, his insanity was practically accepted fact. Judges sighed at the mention of his name, assuming another round of doctors' reports would follow. For the FBI, each day watching him was a reminder of their own impotence. They could bug rooms, trail cars, flip informants, but how do you convict a ghost? How do you hold accountable a man who convinces the world he is incapable of understanding the charges against him? Frustration curdled into obsession. Some agents swore they would prove the act one day, but proof was always just out of reach. And so the Oddfather legend grew. He became the butt of jokes in newspapers, the subject of late-night comedy routines. Cartoonists drew him wandering the streets, slippers dragging. But beneath the humor, a darker truth lingered. While the world laughed, Vincent remained untouchable, his empire thriving. The robe was his shield, the nonsense his armor. In the theater of crime, he had created a role no one else could play. But every act, no matter how perfect, carries a flaw. Beneath the surface of laughter and pity, cracks were forming. Surveillance was advancing. Younger agents, less willing to accept the myth, were pushing harder. Rivals within the Mafia wondered if the performance could last forever. And Vincent himself, disciplined as he was, could not control every detail. All it would take was one slip, one overheard conversation, one witness who dared to speak the truth. For now, though, the Oddfather walked the streets of Greenwich Village, robes swaying, slippers whispering against the pavement, his muttering drifting into the night air. Neighbors laughed, agents cursed, judges sighed, and the Genovese family flourished. The act was working. The question was, how long could he keep it up before the mask began to crack? The door of the Triangle Social Club creaked open on a winter evening, and the familiar smell of smoke, espresso, and damp wool coats filled the air. Men shuffled inside, nodding to one another, lowering their voices as they passed through the threshold. From the outside, the club looked harmless, even ordinary, just another storefront on Sullivan Street with dusty windows and faded curtains. But inside, it was something else entirely. This was the nerve center of Vincent Gigante's world, the place where decisions were whispered into being and where fortunes were made and broken with a nod. By the late 1970s, Greenwich Village was no longer just his neighborhood. It was his kingdom. Building that kingdom didn't happen with loud declarations or bloody street battles. It happened the way Vincent preferred to work, quietly, methodically, step by step. The robe and slippers he wore outside created an image of weakness, a mask that fooled judges, neighbors, even the press. But behind the curtains of the social clubs, the truth revealed itself. There, he was not a frail man muttering to himself. He was the boss, calm, deliberate, and dangerously precise. Social clubs were the foundation of his fiefdom. To the public, they looked like old men's hangouts, places where retirees played cards or argued about baseball. But in reality, they were command posts. Deals were struck over espresso, disputes settled with whispers. If the streets of Greenwich Village were veins, then the clubs were the heart, pumping power and money through the body of the Genovese family. Vincent made sure his heart beat steady. Control of the village meant control of the rackets that ran through it. Gambling dens flourished in backrooms. Loan sharking kept desperate men tethered by chains of debt. Construction jobs, union contracts, and city permits all ran smoother, or stalled, depending on who controlled the flow of envelopes. Even legitimate businesses felt the weight of his shadow. A bakery might survive untouched if it paid respect. Another might find itself strangled by inspections and harassment if it refused. It was less about brute force than about making people understand there was no alternative. Vincent ruled with a blend of fear and restraint. Violence was always on the table, but it wasn't the first option. His strength was his ability to make others comply without needing to spill blood. When he did resort to force, it was controlled, surgical, never sloppy. Like a chess player, he moved only when the move mattered, and when he struck, it left no doubt who was in charge. The robe and muttering might have played in the streets, but in the clubs, there was no act. His men saw him for what he was, a strategist, a leader who never wasted words. The village itself changed under his watch. The sidewalks carried an invisible order. Shopkeepers knew whom to greet, whom to avoid. Residents understood that disputes could be settled more quickly at the club than at a police station. The courts moved slow, but the Genovese family moved fast. If someone owed money, if someone had a problem with a landlord, if someone needed protection, the Triangle and other clubs offered solutions at a price. For many, it was easier to live under Gigante's rules than to fight them. Law enforcement struggled to penetrate the fiefdom. The robe and slippers distracted them. Yes, but the real obstacle was the discipline of the Genovese family. Unlike other mafia outfits where men bragged and flaunted, Vincent demanded silence. His soldiers mirrored his restraint. They didn't seek headlines. They didn't pick fights without orders. That discipline made the family harder to infiltrate, harder to indict. The FBI could watch from across the street, cameras hidden in cars, but what they captured was mostly silence, men sipping coffee, conversations too low to record. The social clubs looked harmless, even boring, yet inside, they pulsed with control. It wasn't just about money. Power in the Mafia was about territory, about carving out a domain where every brick and every sidewalk paid tribute. Greenwich Village was Vincent's domain, but its reach extended far beyond. Through unions and construction rackets, he tied the family into the bones of the city itself. Every building raised, every street repaired, carried a piece of the Genovese touch. Like ivy creeping over walls, his influence spread slowly, steadily, until it was everywhere, impossible to remove. His ability to balance his act with his authority became legendary. In the morning, he might shuffle outside in slippers, muttering nonsense that neighbors repeated as jokes. By afternoon, he might be in a back room, overseeing decisions worth millions, guiding his captains with a few quiet words. It was a dual life lived with such discipline that even his closest allies sometimes marveled at it. He made the absurd believable, and the believable invisible. For the men under him, the fiefdom offered both stability and opportunity. Soldiers could count on steady earnings. Captains could expand rackets with his blessing, and the family thrived without the constant wars that tore others apart. But stability came with strict rules. Disobedience was not tolerated. Betrayal was met with swift consequences. Even without shouting, Vincent's authority was absolute. His silence was heavier than another man's threats. The village itself seemed to bend around him. Tourists walked through its crooked streets, admiring cafes and galleries, unaware that just beyond those doors, one of the most powerful mafia families in America was conducting business. Residents went about their lives, some grateful for the order, others resentful of the shadow. But all understood the truth. You couldn't live in Greenwich Village in those years without brushing against the reach of the Oddfather. Law enforcement intensified their efforts, planting bugs, sending undercover agents, trying to pierce the shield. But Vincent was always one step ahead. The robe made him laughable in the public eye, and the clubs made him untouchable in private. The frustration grew until agents began to question if they would ever bring him down. How do you prosecute a man who convinces the world he's insane, yet runs an empire with ruthless precision? Behind the laughter of neighbors and the muttering in the streets, the Greenwich Village fiefdom thrived. Money flowed like a hidden river, washing through clubs, rackets, and unions. Respect flowed with it, carried on whispers and nods. The robe and slippers were only one layer of the mask. The real shield was the discipline he demanded, the silence that made the Genovese family the most enduring of all the Mafia dynasties. But every kingdom, no matter how well fortified, carries cracks. The longer Vincent played his double role, the more attention he drew from prosecutors determined to expose him. Younger agents, unjaded by years of frustration, pushed harder, dug deeper. Rivals, too, watched closely, waiting for a moment of weakness. The Oddfather had built his fiefdom brick by brick, but the question loomed like a storm on the horizon. How long could even the most disciplined empire hold back the inevitable tide? And as the night fell once more on Sullivan Street, the Triangle Social Club buzzed quietly, men leaning over tables, whispers carrying decisions that would ripple through the city. Outside, the figure of a man in slippers muttered to himself, shuffling past. To the casual eye, he was a harmless eccentric. To those inside, he was the king of the village, ruling an empire built on silence. Yet kings, no matter how quiet, cannot rule forever. The cracks were coming, and when they spread, the robe alone might not be enough to protect him. The church bells of Greenwich Village tolled softly one Sunday morning in the late 1970s, their sound drifting through the crooked streets and narrow alleys. In a pew near the front of a small parish sat one of the Gigante brothers, his collar white, his head bowed in prayer. Just blocks away, in the haze of cigarette smoke and whispered deals, another brother reviewed legal papers, his pen scratching against documents that could shift the course of a trial. And further still, in the shadows of the Triangle Social Club, Vincent Gigante muttered nonsense under his breath, playing the role of the broken man. To outsiders, the Gigante family looked scattered, one in the pulpit, one in the courtroom, one in the underworld. But to those who knew better, they were not scattered at all. They were bound together, each brother playing his part in a loyalty system so tight it became one of the most effective shields Vincent ever had. The Gigante family was unusual in the Mafia world. Most mobsters came from households where everyone's path bent toward the same street corners, the same rackets. But the Gigante brothers were different. They spread themselves across different walks of life, religion, law, community service. To the outside world, it painted a picture of respectability, a family rooted in faith and public trust. But beneath the surface, those roles became a protective barrier around Vincent, reinforcing his act and deflecting suspicion. One brother, a priest, carried himself with the dignity of the cloth, a man who spoke of forgiveness and faith even as his own family was entwined in the underworld. Parishioners saw him as a moral compass, a man who offered guidance in times of darkness. Few could reconcile the image of the devout priest with the rumors swirling around his brother in the village. Yet his presence lent a kind of unspoken credibility to Vincent's public performance. If a priest could vouch for him, if a priest prayed for him, how could the world see him as anything but a troubled soul rather than a calculating boss? Another brother, a lawyer, became equally important in shielding him. Courtrooms are battlefields of their own, and in those battles, words are weapons. Vincent's act needed constant reinforcement, a legal framework that could translate muttered nonsense into official diagnoses. The lawyer brother knew how to craft arguments, how to challenge evidence, how to stall proceedings. He understood the cracks in the system and pressed against them until walls of bureaucracy buckled. Again and again, he helped buy Vincent time, months, years, even decades, by framing the Oddfather persona not as deception, but as tragic illness. The rest of the brothers, though less public in their roles, still formed a wall of loyalty around him. They were the eyes and ears, the ones who made sure the family remained united, who discouraged gossip, who reinforced the idea that Vincent was sick, frail, incapable of leading anything. In the Gigante household, silence was a rule as sacred as prayer. No one betrayed him, not even in whispers. Their loyalty was ironclad, and it turned the family name into something both untouchable and untarnished in the eyes of outsiders. It was this unusual mix, faith, law, family, that created one of the strongest shields any mob boss ever had. Prosecutors found themselves cornered not only by psychiatrists' notes and defense lawyers' arguments, but also by the moral weight of a family that appeared, at least on paper, respectable. Judges hesitated, juries sympathized. How could a man with brothers in the church and the law be the cold mastermind of a mafia empire? The contradiction itself was part of the mask. For Vincent, the bond with his brothers went deeper than convenience. Loyalty wasn't just a strategy, it was blood. In a world where betrayal was constant, where friends turned informants and allies became enemies, the loyalty of family was priceless. He trusted them in ways he could trust no one else. They carried not only his secrets, but his survival. And in turn, they carried the burden of living double lives, publicly respectable, privately tied to one of the most feared mafia figures in America. But there was tension hidden in that loyalty. For the priest, whispers about his brother's underworld dealings must have weighed heavy against the sermons he delivered on Sundays. For the lawyer, each argument in court was not just a defense of a client, but a shield for his own blood, a conflict of duty and family. These men lived with contradictions as sharp as knives, balancing faith and law against loyalty and silence. Behind closed doors, there must have been fear of exposure, fear of guilt, fear of what might happen if the truth ever broke through the mask. In Greenwich Village, however, the Gigante brothers became part of the myth. Neighbors knew them, saw them in church, in court, on the street. The contrast only deepened the image of Vincent as a tragic figure rather than a cunning boss. When he wandered in his robe, muttering to himself, people shook their heads in pity, not suspicion. And when questions arose, there were always brothers ready to testify to his fragility, to paint him as a man broken by life rather than hardened by crime. Law enforcement knew the truth, or thought they did. Agents muttered in frustration about the wall of protection around him, how every angle they pursued collapsed under the weight of family loyalty. They bugged phones, planted informants, followed trails of money. But time and again, they ran into silence. The Oddfather Act worked in part because Vincent committed to it, but it worked just as much because his family committed to it with him. Their combined roles, priest, lawyer, loyal brother, formed a fortress around him that was nearly impossible to breach. Still, cracks have a way of forming, even in the strongest walls. As the years passed, prosecutors sharpened their tools, surveillance technology grew more sophisticated, and rival families began to murmur about the charade. Could a man really be both a mumbling ghost in slippers and the invisible hand guiding an empire? The contradictions that once shielded him began to draw curiosity. Investigators pushed harder, determined to prove what the world refused to see. For now, though, the brothers stood firm, their loyalty unshaken. The priest preached, the lawyer argued, and Vincent shuffled through the village in his robe, his empire humming quietly in the background. The shield held, and the Oddfather's legend grew stronger. Yet behind the laughter of neighbors and the frustration of agents, one truth lingered like smoke in the air. The higher the walls of loyalty, the more devastating the fall when cracks finally appear. And as the sun set over Greenwich Village, casting long shadows across Sullivan Street, the Triangle Social Club buzzed with quiet business. Vincent's brothers, each in their own way, had shielded him once again. But shadows stretch, and masks eventually slip. The family that had protected him so well would soon face questions no sermon, no argument, and no On a chilly night in the mid-1980s, the world's cameras flashed wildly outside the Rave Night Social Club. John Gotti, draped in silk and swagger, grinned as though the court summons in his hand were a lottery ticket. He thrived on the spectacle, the limelight, the intoxicating rush of celebrity. But just a few miles away, in a much quieter corner of Greenwich Village, Vincent Gigante shuffled in his robe, muttering nonsense to the pavement, invisible to the public eye. And yet, while Gotti played to the crowd, it was Gigante who quietly commanded the most disciplined and powerful family in the American Mafia. He was the quiet boss, the shadow in slippers, ruling not with noise, but with absence. What made Vincent different was not only his act of madness, but his refusal to indulge in the ego that consumed other mob bosses. In the underworld, reputation was everything. Men bragged about their power, showed off their cars, strutted into restaurants where doors opened before them. But Vincent had seen enough to know that attention was poison. The louder you lived, the faster the law came knocking. Gotti wanted to be the dapper Don. Gigante chose to be the invisible hand. And invisibility, in time, proved stronger than silk ties. From the backrooms of the Triangle Social Club, he orchestrated the family with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. Soldiers knew their places. Captains followed orders without hesitation. Unlike the chaos of other families, where ambition sparked infighting and betrayal, the Genovese family thrived under discipline. Vincent demanded silence, demanded patience, demanded that no one seek fame. In a world built on fragile egos, he cultivated restraint. That was his genius. Law enforcement could barely touch him. Surveillance photos showed a frail man in slippers, wandering the village, muttering nonsense. Prosecutors fumed, agents raged, but the image stuck. The robe became a shield, deflecting every attempt to paint him as a calculating leader. While other bosses faced trial after trial, Vincent's name slid through courtrooms like smoke, too insubstantial to grasp. He didn't deny the charges directly. He let the act deny them for him. Inside the family, his authority was absolute, even if outsiders doubted it. Men who sat across from him in private saw no trace of madness. His gaze was steady, his orders clear, his memory sharp. He gave instructions with few words, but those words carried weight. Soldiers learned quickly that beneath the muttering act lived a man who saw everything, remembered everything, and forgave nothing. His silence was a weapon sharper than any threat. The contrast with Gotti could not have been more striking. The press adored the flamboyant Gambino boss, splashing his face across front pages, making him into a criminal celebrity. But that same celebrity doomed him, drawing relentless heat until he was convicted and locked away. Vincent, meanwhile, was almost a ghost. Few outside the village even knew what he looked like. Reporters joked about his robe, comedians mocked him on stage, but while the world laughed, his empire thrived. The Genovese family earned more money than any other, ran more rackets, and maintained more stability than the flashier clans. Invisibility, Vincent proved, was the ultimate armor. The genius of his leadership was how ordinary it looked. The Triangle Social Club was no fortress. It was a shabby storefront, its windows clouded with dust. Inside, the decor was plain, the tables scarred, the chairs wobbly. Nothing about it screamed power. And yet, in that unassuming room, decisions were made that rippled across the city. Union strikes organized, contracts won, rivals silenced. The banality of the setting was the point. By hiding in plain sight, by making himself look pitiful and weak, Vincent turned his headquarters into the last place anyone expected a boss to sit. But even among his own, the act sometimes bled into the man. Soldiers recounted how he could sit for long stretches in silence, staring at the floor, muttering just loudly enough to unsettle even those who knew it was fake. Was it still just an act, or had decades of performance seeped into his bones? That uncertainty became part of his power. If even his closest men couldn't always tell where the mask ended and the man began, how could law enforcement ever hope to? In the underworld, image is as important as money, and Vincent's image was carefully crafted, even if it looked absurd. Where Gotti's image was wealth and confidence, Gigante's was frailty and confusion. But while Gotti's image brought him down, Gigante's image kept him free. He understood that ridicule was a shield, that laughter was less dangerous than fear. If the world believed he was broken, they would never look for the sharpness in his silence. For the FBI, it was maddening. They had wiretaps of men whispering about Chin, about his orders and influence. They had photos of him entering the clubs, men kissing his hand in respect. But every time they tried to bring him to court, psychiatrists arrived with folders of medical reports, describing delusions and paranoia. Judges hesitated, cases stalled, and Vincent walked back to the village in slippers, untouchable. His robe was more effective than any lawyer's argument, more impenetrable than any fortress wall. The quiet boss knew patience was his greatest ally. While others rushed, he waited. While others boasted, he listened. He outlasted rivals not by force alone, but by letting them burn themselves out in the spotlight. His empire thrived because he understood the oldest truth of power. The more invisible you are, the harder you are to destroy. Yet invisibility came at cost. To live forever behind a mask requires discipline, yes, but it also requires sacrifice. Vincent rarely allowed himself to enjoy the trappings of wealth, the luxuries that other bosses flaunted. His world was small, confined to the village, to the clubs, to his tightly controlled circle. He lived not as a king on a throne, but as a ghost haunting the same streets night after night. To outsiders, it looked like madness. To him, it was survival. The robe dragged along the pavement as he shuffled once more through Sullivan Street, muttering nonsense under his breath. Neighbors shook their heads, laughing at the odd figure in slippers. Behind them, In the back rooms of his fiefdom, soldiers leaned forward, listening carefully to his quiet instructions. The world saw a fool. His men saw a boss. But even the most carefully crafted masks cannot last forever. The longer he wore it, the more law enforcement pushed, the more technology advanced, the more cracks began to form. For years, he had ruled as the invisible hand, the quiet boss who let the world underestimate him. The question that lingered was simple, yet dangerous. How long could even the Oddfather stay hidden in plain sight before the tape recorder clicked on in a cramped FBI office, its reels spinning as agents leaned over transcripts of yet another surveillance job? Hours of muffled conversations, the clinking of coffee cups, and half-finished whispers from inside the Triangle Social Club filled the room. The name they were chasing kept surfacing. Chin. Always Chin. Always said with a kind of reverence, a deference that told them this man was the one in charge. But then they'd look at the photographs pinned to the board. The frail figure in a bathrobe, shuffling across Sullivan Street, muttering to himself, and the frustration thickened. Was this the man who ran the most disciplined Mafia family in America? Or was he really what he appeared to be, a broken soul lost in his own madness? By the late 1970s and into the 80s, Vincent Gigante had become more than just another Mafia boss. To the FBI, he had become an obsession. Other dons flaunted their wealth and swagger, giving agents plenty of material for courtrooms. John Gotti strutted for the cameras. Carmine Persico boasted. Anthony Fat Tony Salerno sat at card tables, as though his presence alone declared power. But Gigante? He gave him nothing. No photos in sharp suits. No speeches on courthouse steps. Just a bathrobe, slippers, and muttering nonsense as he wandered through his neighborhood like a ghost. It was infuriating because they knew it was an act. Informants whispered that Chin was sharp, that he issued orders with icy precision, that no decision in the Genovese family was made without his approval. Captains described meetings where Vincent sat calm, clear-eyed, in control. But once the law came knocking, the act returned in full force. Slurred speech in front of doctors, blank stares in the courtroom, a mumbling shuffle out of the judge's chambers. Time and again, he sidestepped justice with a performance so convincing that even trained psychiatrists sometimes doubted themselves. Trials became endless loops of frustration. Prosecutors would build cases for months, sometimes years, only to watch them collapse under stacks of medical reports. Defense attorneys produced doctors who testified that Vincent was delusional, paranoid, incapable of even understanding the charges. Judges hesitated. No one wanted to be the man who put a broken, sick figure on trial. The justice system thrives on the appearance of fairness, and Gigante exploited that weakness like a surgeon. One prosecutor later admitted that trying to bring Chin to justice was like boxing with smoke. You could swing with all your strength, but the target was never really there. The robe, the muttering, the medical records, they formed a shield stronger than any lawyer's argument. And the longer the act went on, the harder it was to disprove. Madness is slippery. It can't be measured with certainty. If a doctor says a man is insane, who is a jury to argue otherwise? For the agents on the ground, the frustration boiled over. They watched him every day, knew he was running an empire, knew men were paying tribute to him, knew his silence was just a mask. Yet every time they tried to break through, the act held. They would tail him from his home to the Triangle Social Club, cameras snapping every step. They would record hours of footage. But what did they capture? A man mumbling at pigeons. A man staring at cracks in the sidewalk. A man crossing the street in his robe while drivers swore at him. Evidence? Yes. Proof? Never. The nickname, the Oddfather, began to circulate in the press, first as a joke, then as a label. Comedians mocked him. Cartoonists sketched him wandering aimlessly. To the FBI, the laughter stung, because behind the jokes, behind the pity, was a man who was still untouchable, still running the most lucrative family in organized crime. It felt like the country itself was mocking them every time his name appeared in print. Courtrooms became theaters of absurdity. Prosecutors would call witnesses who testified about Vincent's control of rackets and social clubs. Then the defense would roll in psychiatrists with charts describing delusions, paranoia, schizophrenia. Gigante himself would sit there, slouched, drooling, muttering incoherently. Judges shook their heads. Juries looked uneasy. Was this really the fearsome mafia boss the FBI described? Or was it, as the defense insisted, just a tragic man lost to illness? Again and again, the gavel fell in his favor, not through acquittals, but through delays, dismissals, mistrials. Justice was paralyzed, tied in knots by his performance. For decades, it worked. Vincent stayed free while other bosses were paraded in shackles. The Genovese family continued to thrive, growing richer, more disciplined, more feared, even as their leader supposedly wandered the streets like a fool. Agents began to joke bitterly among themselves, saying the robe was more powerful than any gun. It was gallows humor, but it carried a bitter truth. The FBI tried new tactics. They planted bugs in apartments, wired phones, leaned on informants harder than ever. Slowly, cracks began to appear. Recordings captured Vincent giving instructions, his voice steady, not slurred. Witnesses described meetings where he was sharp and clear. But even with those glimpses, it was never enough to fully pierce the mask. In court, the defense always had one more doctor, one more report, one more explanation for why the evidence didn't matter. The frustration was endless, each attempt to corner him slipping through like water through fingers. For the agents who spent their careers chasing him, Gigante wasn't just a target, he was a torment. They could convict other mobsters, dismantle other families, but as long as Chin shuffled the streets of Greenwich Village in his robe, they felt mocked. Each muttered nonsense phrase, each blank stare at a judge, was another reminder of how powerless they were against a man who had turned the system's compassion into his weapon. The years stretched on. Prosecutors retired, agents were reassigned, but the Oddfather remained, his robe dragging along the sidewalks, slippers whispering against the pavement. He was the ghost the FBI couldn't catch, the headache they couldn't cure. And, as the 1980s turned into the 90s, the question grew sharper, heavier, impossible to ignore. How long could the act last? How long before the mask slipped? For the first time, whispers spread, not just among agents but within the underworld itself. Was Chin really untouchable? Or was time running out for the man who had fooled the courts for decades? The FBI's headache was about to become a full-blown obsession. And when obsession deepens, it only takes one crack, one slip, for the entire illusion to shatter. The camera lights flashed outside the courthouse, and a crowd of reporters leaned forward, hungry for a glimpse. They weren't there to see a glamorous movie star or a celebrated politician. They were waiting for a mob boss in a bathrobe. When Vincent Gigante was led past them, shuffling, muttering, his robe hanging loosely from his shoulders, the journalists pounced. Some asked questions they knew he wouldn't answer. Others simply chuckled. It was a spectacle now, less crime and more theater. To the world outside Greenwich Village, Vincent, the Chin Gigante, was no longer just another mafia figure. He had become the Oddfather. The name stuck almost instantly. Headlines loved it, the public remembered it, and comedians ran wild with it. The Oddfather. It was perfect, absurd, mocking, and unforgettable. Late-night television hosts joked about him. Sketch comedians mimicked his shuffle. Cartoonists drew him wandering the streets with wide, empty eyes. For most Americans, who had no idea about the depth of the Genovese family's power, the Oddfather became a caricature, a punchline in slippers. What they didn't realize was how perfectly this ridicule fit Vincent's plan. Public perception is a powerful thing, and Gigante had turned it into his armor. By laughing at him, the world was also underestimating him. Prosecutors could scream about racketeering. Agents could swear he was pulling the strings. But the moment the newspapers published another cartoon of the robe-wearing mobster, the myth of his madness only deepened. Humor became his camouflage. The fascination with him in the media also revealed something about America itself. The Mafia had always been larger than life in the public imagination. From the days of Lucky Luciano to the flamboyance of John Gotti, mob bosses were cast as characters in an ongoing drama. Gigante flipped the script. Where others leaned into glamour, he leaned into absurdity. His robe and muttering became his costume, his act of madness his role. The Oddfather persona turned him into a kind of anti-celebrity, mocked, ridiculed, but talked about endlessly. Neighbors in Greenwich Village saw it firsthand. Some chuckled when they spotted him wandering the streets, telling reporters it was a shame what had become of him. Others admitted it was strange, even unsettling, how perfectly he seemed to embody madness. Each sighting became another story, another piece of folklore that rippled beyond the village and into the headlines. Soon, tourists came to Sullivan Street, hoping to catch a glimpse of him, like he was some bizarre attraction. The FBI, meanwhile, seethed. Every joke, every headline, every sketch on television that mocked the Oddfather added another layer of frustration. They knew the truth, but the public perception drowned them out. The more ridiculous he appeared, the harder it was to convince juries and judges that he was a criminal mastermind. The very thing that turned him into a pop culture punchline also turned him into a nearly untouchable boss. It wasn't the first time organized crime had crossed into pop culture, but it was one of the strangest. Gotti was compared to movie stars. Gigante was compared to cartoon characters. One boss leaned on style, the other on absurdity. Yet both, in their own ways, proved how powerful image could be. In the Mafia, reputation was as important as money. And Vincent's reputation, no matter how strange, served him perfectly. The Oddfather persona grew so large that it began to eclipse the real man. For many outside the underworld, the robe-wearing figure was all they knew of him. They didn't see the calculating boss behind closed doors, the man who managed the most disciplined family in organized crime. They only saw the character, and like all characters, he was consumed by the audience, turned into stories, jokes, sketches, and punchlines that took on a life of their own. But beneath the laughter, there was always unease. Could a man really fool the courts for decades with nothing more than a robe and a shuffle? Could the act be so convincing that even psychiatrists doubted themselves? Each joke carried a shadow, a reminder that the Oddfather wasn't just a comedy sketch. He was real, and his power was real. The humor softened the edges, but the truth was sharper than most dared to admit. As the 1980s rolled into the 90s, the Oddfather persona became firmly cemented in pop culture. He was written about in books, parodied in television, and whispered about in bars. Some even admired the brilliance of the act, calling it one of the greatest cons in American criminal history. Others dismissed him as pathetic, a relic of a bygone era. But no matter the opinion, his name stayed in circulation, his robe and slippers etched into the public memory. For Vincent, the jokes and cartoons didn't matter. What mattered was that they worked. Each laugh, each headline, was another brick in the wall between him and conviction. While the world chuckled, he kept ruling. While comedians mimicked a shuffle, he kept giving orders. And while the newspapers mocked him as the Oddfather, the Genovese family remained the strongest and most disciplined mafia organization in the country. Still, fame, whether glamorous or absurd, always carries risk. The very persona that shielded him also kept him in the spotlight. The FBI was not going to let a punchline defeat them forever. Each joke was a bruise to their pride, and pride has a way of turning into determination. The laughter that protected Vincent also fueled the obsession of the men hunting him. An obsession always finds cracks. So while the Oddfather shuffled through the streets, muttering to himself, becoming a legend of ridicule, the walls around him were quietly tightening. Pop culture had given him protection, but it had also magnified him. And the more magnified he became, the harder it would be to stay invisible. The jokes might have been endless, but somewhere behind the laughter, the hunt for the truth was growing sharper by the day. The door to the Triangle Social Club swung shut with a dull thud, sealing out the noise of Sullivan Street. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the low murmur of men speaking in half sentences. No one raised their voice. No one drew attention. And at the far end of the room, in a worn chair beneath a yellowed light bulb, sat Vincent Gigante. To outsiders, he was the muttering figure in a robe who shuffled through the streets like a ghost. But in this room, he was something else entirely. The architect of an empire that, by the 1970s and 80s, had become the most powerful and disciplined crime family in America. The Genovese Empire didn't roar with flamboyance. It didn't strut like the Gambinos or revel in notoriety like John Gotti's crew. It moved like a tide, steady, quiet, and unstoppable. Its strength came from the rackets that had always been the lifeblood of organized crime: gambling, loan sharking, construction, labor unions. But under Vincent's watch, those rackets didn't just generate money. They built a machine, one that reached into the bones of the city itself. Gambling was the heartbeat. From dice games in backrooms to sprawling betting operations tied to horse racing and sports, the money never stopped flowing. It was steady, predictable, and addictive. Gamblers always lost in the long run, and every loss fed the coffers of the Genovese family. Vincent didn't need to appear the games. His men ran them with discipline, making sure the profits found their way back to the top. Loan sharking was the muscle. When banks turned men away, the Genovese family opened their doors. Cash was handed over quickly, no paperwork, no questions asked. But the interest rates were brutal, designed to bleed borrowers dry. And if someone fell behind, there were consequences, quiet first, then sharper. A broken hand, a wrecked business, a family threatened. Vincent didn't need to deliver the warnings himself. His reputation was enough. Everyone in the village knew that the chin's reach could find you, no matter where you try to hide. Construction became the crown jewel. The Genovese family infiltrated unions, bent contracts, and controlled bids. If a skyscraper rose in Manhattan, chances were good that money flowed into Genovese pockets. They didn't just skim. They decided who got the jobs, who supplied the materials, who won the contracts. Developers learned quickly that if they wanted their projects to run smoothly, they had to play by Vincent's rules. Refusal meant delays, strikes, sudden shortages. Compliance meant profit. It was extortion hidden behind the language of business, a racket so deeply woven into the city that even honest builders found themselves paying tribute. Other rackets followed, hijacking trucks, controlling nightclubs, skimming from the unions. Every stream of money, no matter how small, found its way into the larger river of wealth flowing back to the family. And through it all, Vincent remained invisible. He didn't sit at flashy restaurants or pose for cameras. He let his captains handle the noise while he stayed in the shadows. It was leadership by absence, paradoxical but effective. What made the Genovese Empire different under Vincent was its discipline. Other families tore themselves apart with ambition, with captains jockeying for power, with bosses demanding attention. Vincent demanded silence. No one was to brag. No one was to seek the spotlight. His men understood that the robe and slippers weren't just an act for the courts. They were a lesson. If the boss could make himself invisible, so could they. And invisibility meant survival. For law enforcement, the empire was a nightmare. Every time they tried to corner Vincent, they ran into the mask of madness. Every time they tried to penetrate his rackets, they found layers of buffers and middlemen. The Genovese family operated like a fortress without walls. Every man loyal, every man cautious, every man disciplined. Informants were rare, betrayals rarer. Where other families cracked under pressure, the Genovese machine kept turning, oiled by money and silence. To the public, the contradictions were dizzying. On one hand, newspapers published photos of Vincent wandering the streets in a bathrobe, muttering nonsense. On the other hand, rumors swirled that he controlled billions in rackets across New York. How could both be true? That was the brilliance of his rule. The absurdity of the Oddfather Act masked the cold precision of the empire he commanded. While comedians laughed, skyscrapers rose under his control, and fortunes were built on the back of his silence. Within the family, loyalty to him was absolute. Soldiers knew he wasn't to be underestimated. Captains understood that disobedience was fatal. Even rival bosses grudgingly respected him. He had built something unique, a family that grew stronger not by shouting, but by whispering. The robe, the muttering, the invisibility, it wasn't weakness. It was strategy. A strategy that made the Genovese family the most enduring of all the Mafia dynasties. But power, even quiet power, always carries risk. The FBI was adapting. Technology was advancing. Bugs grew smaller, wiretaps sharper, surveillance more relentless. And as much as Vincent thrived in silence, the empire he built left trails. Money trails, whispers from associates, cracks in the walls. Agents grew more determined, more obsessed, convinced that one day they would pierce the mask. For now, though, the Genovese empire thrived in the shadows. Gambling dens buzzed, construction projects hummed, money flowed, and Vincent remained a ghost in slippers. The robe was a disguise. The silence was a weapon. And the empire he built was stronger than ever. Yet in the quiet halls of the FBI, frustration turned to obsession. They knew he was guilty. They knew he was powerful. They just couldn't prove it. And the longer the robe shuffled down Sullivan Street, the sharper their determination grew. The walls were tightening, even if no one inside the Triangle Club felt it yet. And as the city lit up each night, neon flashing over the village, one truth remained. Vincent's invisibility had made him untouchable. But invisibility, no matter how disciplined, is never perfect. Sooner or later, the sound was faint at first, just the scrape of chairs on a worn floor, the clinking of espresso cups, the shuffle of cards being dealt. For months, it had been all the FBI heard through their hidden microphones, the dull drone of men killing time in smoky rooms. But then, one night in the late 1980s, the tape recorder whirred and voices sharpened. Orders were being given. Money was being discussed. And among the voices, steady and deliberate, was Vincent Gigante. Not the muttering fool in the bathrobe the world thought they knew, but a calm, lucid boss, guiding his empire with precision. For the FBI, it was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Planting bugs in Mafia social clubs was always a dangerous gamble. These places were fortresses in their own way, not with locks and guards, but with suspicion. Every unfamiliar face was scrutinized, every sound questioned. Yet the FBI had grown desperate. The Oddfather Act had paralyzed their cases for years, and prosecutors were tired of losing. So agents risked it all, slipping into apartments and social clubs under cover of night, drilling holes, wiring microphones, hiding transmitters and lamps, outlets, even the walls themselves. At first, the results were frustrating. The men spoke in code, conversations trailed into whispers, and long stretches of silence filled the tapes. It was like trying to decipher smoke. But slowly, pieces emerged, mentions of rackets, names of soldiers, the subtle acknowledgement that Vincent's hand was guiding it all. The robe and slippers were a costume for the public, but behind closed doors, the mask dropped. The tapes captured him speaking clearly, his voice carrying authority. For the agents who had spent years watching him shuffle the streets, the contrast was electrifying. The same man who muttered gibberish at pigeons was now discussing construction contracts, union votes, and money collections with absolute clarity. There was no sign of madness, no hint of confusion. The robe-wearing ghost of Sullivan Street had vanished, replaced by the sharp strategist the FBI always believed he was. The most famous breakthrough came from a bug planted in a Manhattan apartment, where meetings were held away from prying eyes. On tape, Vincent could be heard directing captains, weighing decisions, settling disputes. He wasn't ranting. He wasn't incoherent. He was deliberate, cautious, commanding. For prosecutors, it was the missing puzzle piece, the proof that the Oddfather Act was a shield, not a sickness. But even with the tapes, the battle wasn't simple. Defense attorneys argued that recordings could be misunderstood, that voices could be misattributed, that context was missing. They pointed again to the stacks of psychiatric evaluations, insisting Vincent was too broken to truly understand what he was saying. Yet every new tape chipped away at that defense. Each recording revealed a man more coherent, more capable, more dangerous than the courts had been led to believe. The FBI's obsession deepened. Agents who had once cursed his muttering now replayed his voice for hours, studying every word. They built charts, traced connections, followed money trails that spread out from the clubs into unions, construction firms, gambling dens, even legitimate businesses. What emerged was a map of power unlike anything they had seen before. The Genovese family wasn't just surviving under Gigante, it was thriving. And it was thriving because of his leadership. The frustration of decades began to lift, replaced by determination. For the first time, the Oddfather looked vulnerable. His robe no longer seemed impenetrable, his nonsense no longer untouchable. The tapes had pierced the mask, if only slightly, and prosecutors saw their chance. But Vincent was not a man to underestimate. Even as the FBI celebrated their bugging successes, he adapted. Meetings shifted, voices lowered, codes tightened. He had spent a lifetime surviving, and he wasn't about to surrender easily. The robe act grew stronger, his public appearances more absurd, as though doubling down on the image that had protected him for so long. For the agents listening in darkened rooms, the duality was maddening. By day, they watched him stumble across the village in slippers, drooling and muttering. By night, they played tapes of him directing one of the most powerful criminal empires in America. It was like watching an actor switch roles, slipping seamlessly between characters. Except this wasn't theater, it was survival. The social club bugging marked the beginning of the end, but also the beginning of a new battle. The FBI finally had proof, but proof is fragile. Trials still loomed, defenses would still argue, and juries would still hesitate. The robe wasn't gone, it was just cracked. For Vincent, the act had carried him for decades. Now, with microphones hidden in his own sanctuaries, the question was whether even the Oddfather could keep fooling the world. And as agents rewound the tapes once more, leaning closer to every whispered word, they knew one thing for certain. The walls were closing in. The robe had protected him for years, but the sound of his own voice might. The reel-to-reel tape hissed softly in the FBI office as agents leaned in, their headphones pressed tight. At first, it was the usual background noise, chairs scraping, glasses clinking, the hum of a social club at night. Then the voice came through. Calm, steady, lucid. It was Vincent Gigante, not the shuffling man in a robe, not the mumbling figure neighbors mocked as the Oddfather. This was the real Chin, direct, calculating, speaking with the authority of a man who ran an empire. And in that moment, the agents knew they had it. Clear evidence that the Insanity Act was just that, an act. The wiretaps had been a gamble. Planting them in social clubs and apartments carried enormous risk. One wrong move, one hidden microphone discovered, and the entire operation could collapse. But the payoff was extraordinary. On tape, Vincent wasn't muttering nonsense. He was running the Genovese family like a CEO guiding a corporation. He discussed money flows, settled disputes, ordered collections, and, when necessary, sanctioned violence. The robe and slippers had vanished. The mask was off. One recording captured him giving instructions about a labor union, his tone measured, his words precise. He weighed which contractors should be favored, which bids should be manipulated, which politicians needed pressure. It was business, pure and simple. Business conducted in whispers, hidden from the public eye, but business nonetheless. There was no sign of confusion, no trace of madness. Just a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Another tape revealed something darker. Agents listened as Vincent discussed how to deal with a troublesome associate who had stepped out of line. His words were quiet, almost gentle, but the meaning was clear. Orders were being given. A life was being weighed, and the decision rested with him. In the world of organized crime, this was the ultimate proof of power, not the flash of violence, but the calm authority of the man who decided who lived and who didn't. For prosecutors, the tapes were gold. For years they had been mocked in court by his insanity act. Forced to watch as psychiatrists painted him as a broken man incapable of understanding the world around him. Now, they had his own voice proving otherwise. No doctor could explain away these conversations. No robe or slipper could disguise the clarity of his words. On tape, Vincent wasn't delusional. He was commanding. The FBI pored over the recordings like archaeologists uncovering treasure. Every sentence was cataloged, every name cross-referenced. Patterns emerged. How he delegated to captains, how he demanded discipline, how he managed the family with the same precision as a corporate executive. Where John Gotti strutted in front of cameras, Vincent built his legacy in whispers. The contrast could not have been more striking. Gotti was a celebrity don, Gigante the invisible CEO. But both ruled absolutely, and the tapes proved it. Still, even with this mountain of evidence, the challenge remained. In court, defense attorneys argued that the tapes could be misunderstood, that voices could be misidentified. They leaned once again on the mountains of psychiatric records, insisting that Vincent drifted in and out of lucidity, that the moments caught on tape were exceptions, not the rule. It was a desperate defense, but desperation had worked before. Judges had hesitated, juries had wavered. The robes still carried power. Even as the recordings piled up, the agents listening late into the night didn't doubt what they heard. This wasn't a sick man fumbling through delusions. This was a strategist, a leader who had perfected the art of invisibility. He had fooled psychiatrists, neighbors, even other mobsters. But the wiretaps stripped the act bare. For the first time, the Oddfather was caught not in slippers on the street, but in his own words, his own voice betraying the mask he had worn for decades. One agent later described the experience as finally seeing the ghost in daylight. For years, they had chased shadows, watched robes shuffle across sidewalks, listened to mutters that meant nothing. Now they had clarity, and clarity meant hope. Hope that the most frustrating case in the FBI's history could finally reach its end. But clarity can also be dangerous. The tapes didn't just expose Vincent to prosecutors. They exposed him to rivals, to enemies, to anyone who might hear them and wonder if the Oddfather's mask was slipping. In the Mafia, power depended on image. For years, his image as the invisible, untouchable boss had been unshakable. The recordings threatened to crack that image, not just in court, but in the underworld itself. For now, though, the FBI celebrated quietly. The act had carried Vincent through decades of frustration, but the wiretaps had pierced it. His own voice was now the weapon that could undo him. The robe and slippers had fooled the world, but no disguise could hide what the tapes revealed. A boss in complete control of an empire, running the Genovese family with cold precision. And yet, even as the reel spun in FBI offices, one question lingered. Would it be enough? Would juries finally see through the mask, or would Vincent's performance outlast even the sound of his own voice? The battle wasn't over. The Oddfather still shuffled the streets, still muttered his nonsense, still wore the robe that had shielded him for so long. But now, for the first time, the robe was fraying, and the voice beneath it was echoing louder than ever. The oath of silence had protected Vincent Gigante for decades. Omerta, the sacred Mafia code, was more than a rule. It was a survival mechanism. To break it was to betray not just the family, but the entire world you lived in. For years, the men around Vincent held that silence like a shield, guarding him from prosecutors, shielding him from exposure, protecting the illusion that he was too broken to lead anything. But by the late 1980s and into the 90s, the cracks began to show. And when the first voices dared to speak, the fortress Vincent had built on loyalty began to tremble. The Genovese family had always prided itself on discipline. Unlike the Gambinos, who were plagued by flashy betrayals, or the Colombos, who tore themselves apart in civil wars, the Genovese crew had remained steady under Chin's shadow. His word was law, his silence an example his men followed. They didn't flaunt their power. They didn't boast in bars. They didn't seek headlines. They operated like ghosts, and that ghostly discipline made them almost impossible for law enforcement to infiltrate. For a long time, that silence was unbreakable. But silence comes at cost. Men grow tired of prison sentences. Wives and children grow restless without money. Promises of protection can fray when years pass and the streets move on without you. Prosecutors understood this, and they pressed harder than ever. They offered deals, whispered about reduced sentences, dangled the chance of freedom in exchange for one thing: testimony. Slowly, inevitably, cracks formed. Low-level associates turned first. Men who weren't bound by decades of tradition, who didn't carry the same weight of loyalty as the older generation. They spoke of meetings, of envelopes passed, of whispers about Chin being the real power in Greenwich Village. Their words alone weren't enough to dismantle him, but they added to the growing pile of suspicion, reinforcing what the wiretaps already hinted at, that the robe and slippers were a mask, and behind them was a calculating boss. More dangerous were the insiders. Captains and soldiers who had once sworn unshakable loyalty began to waver under pressure. Some spoke of orders delivered in Vincent's calm voice, instructions too sharp to belong to a man lost in madness. Others described the double life he lived, muttering nonsense in public and then directing million-dollar rackets in private. Each word chipped away at the image he had cultivated. Each testimony made the courts less willing to believe the psychiatrist's reports. For the FBI, these cracks were victories, but for Vincent, they were betrayals that cut deeper than bullets. Loyalty had always been his greatest weapon. It was the glue that held the Genovese family together, the shield that kept him safe behind the mask. To hear his own men, even distant associates, break that silence was to feel the fortress tremble. He had built his empire on discipline, and now discipline was faltering. The betrayals also revealed the darker side of the Oddfather act. For years, his muttering and shuffling had been a shield in the courts, but inside the family, it created unease. Soldiers wondered how long the act could last, how long they could keep pledging loyalty to a man who appeared half-broken in public. Most knew it was a performance, but doubt is a dangerous thing. Doubt corrodes loyalty, and once cracks appear, they spread. Some insiders stayed loyal to the end, insisting on his sanity, defending his reputation, keeping the code alive even when prison walls closed in around them. They saw silence as sacred, a final act of devotion to a boss who had protected them. Others, though, broke under the weight of time. The FBI didn't need everyone to flip. They just needed enough voices to tip the balance, enough whispers to make judges and juries question the myth. In a courtroom, those voices carried power. Prosecutors didn't just present wiretaps and surveillance photos. They put men on the stand, men who had once kissed Shin's hand, men who had once sworn loyalty, and had them speak against him. To see insiders testify was to watch the unthinkable. The robe, the muttering, the act, it all looked thinner when his own men described him as sharp, lucid, and in command. The Oddfather act had worked for decades because it relied on silence. As long as no one inside broke ranks, the mask held. But when the cracks appeared, the mask began to slip. Each turncoat was another fracture, another reminder that even the strongest code could bend under pressure. Omerta was sacred, but prison cells, broken families, and the lure of freedom were powerful weapons in their own right. For Vincent, it was a bitter irony. He had built his life on loyalty, demanded silence from everyone around him, and rewarded those who kept it. Yet in the end, it wasn't law enforcement alone that threatened him. It was his own men, the ones he trusted, the ones who once swore that silence was unbreakable. Still, the code didn't collapse entirely. Many men held fast, refusing to speak, even when it cost them their freedom. That loyalty, fractured but not destroyed, kept the Genovese family alive long after other families crumbled. But the cracks were undeniable, and they marked the beginning of the end for the Oddfather. As the 90s unfolded, The walls that had protected him for so long were eroding. Wiretaps exposed his voice. Informants confirmed his control. Prosecutors grew bolder, judges less sympathetic. The fortress of silence was no longer impenetrable. And yet, even as betrayal spread like hairline fractures through concrete, Vincent still shuffled the streets in his robe, muttering to himself, carrying on the act. To neighbors, he was the same odd figure, pitiable and broken. But inside the FBI, the mood had shifted. They no longer laughed at the robe. They smelled blood. And somewhere deep down, even the Oddfather must have known, every fortress, no matter how strong, eventually falls when the cracks spread far enough. The file on Vincent Gigante grew so thick that agents joked it could break the legs of the desk it sat on. Decades of surveillance photos, transcripts, psychiatric reports, and court filings filled hundreds of boxes. And yet, case after case collapsed, trial after trial stalled. For law enforcement, it was like chasing smoke through a maze. They knew Gigante was guilty. They knew he was the true boss of the Genovese family. But proving it, turning whispers and suspicions into convictions, was a game that stretched across years, then decades. The reason wasn't just his act of madness, though that was its most infamous layer. The truth was deeper. Vincent was a master of caution, a man who understood that the greatest threat to a mob boss wasn't always a rival with a gun. It was a prosecutor with evidence. So he built his empire like a fortress of mirrors, with buffers, decoys, and distractions at every level. By the time law enforcement thought they had reached him, they discovered they were still 2 layers away. He never spoke directly when he could pass a message through intermediaries. Orders filtered down like whispers through the branches of a tree, each captain and soldier carrying only what they needed to know. If a man was arrested, he could only implicate those directly above him. Rarely, if ever, could anyone point directly to Vincent. And when they tried, his lawyers held up medical files like shields, insisting that the robe-wearing Oddfather was incapable of understanding crime, let alone orchestrating it. The courts themselves became part of the battlefield. Defense attorneys played the system with surgical precision. Whenever prosecutors built momentum, new psychiatric evaluations arrived, thick with jargon and diagnoses. Judges hesitated to drag a supposedly delusional man through trial. Juries saw not a ruthless boss, but muttering patient. Months turned into years, years into decades. For law enforcement, it was like trying to sprint through quicksand. But the delays weren't wasted time for Vincent. Every year that passed was another year of freedom, another year of profit for the Genovese family. He knew the value of patience. Where other bosses burned fast and bright, drawing headlines and falling quickly, Vincent stretched his reign across decades by moving slowly, deliberately. He didn't need to dominate the spotlight. He only needed to outlast it. The FBI, meanwhile, had to adapt. In the 1970s, surveillance meant tailing suspects in cars, snapping grainy photos, and hoping for informants. By the 80s and 90s, technology improved. Bugs became smaller, wiretaps sharper, investigations more sophisticated. But even with the advances, Vincent's caution kept him one step ahead. Meetings were brief, conversations coded, and important business often cloaked in casual banter. The Robe Act wasn't just for courtrooms. It was part of his entire defense system. Who would believe that the mumbling man in slippers had just ordered $1 million construction shakedown? Each time agents thought they had their case, it slipped. Witnesses recanted. Evidence grew stale. Defense lawyers filed motion after motion, burying prosecutors in paperwork. Judges dismissed indictments. Frustration turned to obsession. Some agents spent their entire careers chasing him, only to retire without ever seeing him behind bars. Part of the challenge was cultural. The FBI had been trained to deal with mobsters who flaunted their wealth, who wore their power on their sleeves. They knew how to catch the John Goddess of the world. But Gigante was different. He hid in plain sight, not as a king, but as a fool. The robe was more than a disguise. It was a strategy that disarmed the very instincts of investigators. They had been trained to look for wolves, Gigante showed them a sheep, and for years, it worked. The long game wore on both sides. For the FBI, it became a war of attrition, each new investigation another chance to wear him down. For Vincent, it was survival by patience. He knew he couldn't stop them forever, but he could delay, stall, frustrate. Every year out of prison was a victory. Every trial postponed was another hand won in a long game of cards. But the patience of law enforcement has limits. By the late 1980s and into the 90s, the Bureau had learned from its failures. They planted better bugs, flipped more insiders, pressed harder in court. They began to see through the layers, to untangle the buffers, to find cracks in the walls that had protected him. The Robe Act, once a perfect disguise, started to feel worn, frayed at the edges. Still, one could argue that no mob boss in American history played the long game as effectively as Vincent Gigante. While others burned quickly, his caution stretched his reign across 3 decades. He survived not because he was the most violent or the most glamorous, but because he was the most patient. He knew how to wait, how to stall, how to hide behind silence and madness until even his enemies doubted themselves. And yet, patience is not invincibility. The FBI's long obsession meant they never stopped circling, never stopped listening. Each year tightened the net. Each taped conversation, each flipped associate, each motion denied in court was another thread pulling him closer to the center of the web. As the 90s dawned, the Robe still shuffled down Sullivan Street. The muttering still carried on the air. But behind closed doors, the walls were closing in. Law enforcement had learned his game. Now the question was whether even the Oddfather's patience could withstand the weight of decades of obsession pressing in all at once. The cameras crowded the courthouse steps in the early 1990s, their flashes slicing through the gray Manhattan morning. Reporters jostled for position, their microphones ready, their notebooks already filled with background on the man they were about to see. When Vincent Gigante appeared, it was not as the feared boss of the Genovese family, but as the shambling figure the public had come to know, the Oddfather, muttering under his breath, shoulders hunched beneath a warm bathrobe. To the untrained eye, he looked pitiful, lost, fragile. But the papers he carried into that courtroom told a very different story. For the first time in decades, the law had finally caught up with him. The indictments were here. The charges were sweeping. Racketeering, murder conspiracies, extortion, the entire machinery of organized crime, tied to the man who had hidden in plain sight for years. Prosecutors painted him not as a broken patient, but as the quiet architect of the most powerful Mafia family in America. They had the wiretaps, the bug conversations, the testimony of insiders who dared to break omerta. They had built their case brick by brick, determined that this time the robe and slippers would not save him. But Vincent's defense was as familiar as it was maddening. Once again, he leaned on the Insanity Act. His lawyers arrived armed not only with legal arguments, but with stacks of psychiatric evaluations, each one describing him as delusional, paranoid, incapable of understanding the charges against him. In court, he slouched in his chair, eyes vacant, muttering nonsense when addressed. To the jury, it looked like tragedy. To the prosecutors, it looked like theater. The Robe had followed him into the courtroom, and it was still working. The tension inside the courtroom was palpable. On one side, prosecutors replayed tapes of Vincent speaking clearly, directing his captains, managing construction rackets like a corporate CEO. They presented witnesses who described him as sharp, decisive, utterly in control. On the other side, defense attorneys countered with doctors who swore he was incapable of even tying his own shoes. The clash was surreal, as though two entirely different men were on trial. Which one was real, the Oddfather in slippers, or the calculating boss captured on tape? For the FBI agents who had spent years chasing him, watching the trial was equal parts vindication and frustration. They finally had their man in court, facing the charges they had dreamed of bringing. And yet, the performance continued. The robe still dragged across the floor. The muttering still filled the silence. Even with the evidence stacked high, there was still a chance the illusion could sway the jury. The public followed the case with fascination. Headlines splashed his nickname across the front pages. Late-night hosts cracked jokes about the Oddfather shuffling through court. Cartoonists drew him as a confused old man standing on trial while puppeteering soldiers behind him. Pop culture continued to mock him, but the FBI worried that the laughter might again undermine their case. A man who looked ridiculous was harder to convict as a ruthless mastermind. Inside the family, loyalty was strained but not broken. Many still believed in his strength, still followed his orders even as the trial unfolded. Others wondered if the cracks were finally showing, if the mask could hold against the weight of federal prosecutors. But no one dared say it too loudly. Chin still commanded respect, even if he commanded it from behind the guise of frailty. The trial dragged on, delayed by motions, postponed by medical evaluations, stalled by hearings on competency. It was the same pattern that had saved him before: delay, confuse, exhaust the system until prosecutors lost momentum. But this time felt different. The evidence was heavier, the testimony stronger, the patience of the courts thinner. The robe had bought him years, but could it buy him forever? For the prosecutors, the indictment was not just about Vincent. It was about sending a message. No boss, no matter how disciplined or deceptive, was beyond the reach of the law. They were determined that the Oddfather would not shuffle his way out of justice again. But for Vincent, every delay was still a victory. Every postponed hearing was another day of freedom, another day of control, another reminder that patience had always been his sharpest weapon. He had outlasted rivals, agents, and prosecutors before. Why not again? As the trial stretched on, the robe became a symbol of defiance as much as disguise. To the FBI, it mocked their obsession. To his men, it proved his cunning. To the public, it was theater. But beneath the laughter and frustration, one truth lingered. Vincent had finally been brought into the courtroom not as a muttering ghost, but as the accused architect of a criminal empire. And though the robe still dragged, though the muttering still filled the air, the weight of the indictments was undeniable. The walls were closing in. The long game that had protected him for so long was entering its final act. The Oddfather had delayed, disguised, and deceived his way through decades. But in the 90s, with the charges stacked high and the evidence echoing on tape, even Vincent Gigante had to face a question he had avoided his entire life. How long can an act protect a man before the curtain finally falls? The courtroom was a stage, and Vincent Gigante knew his role better than anyone. He shuffled in wearing baggy clothes, his eyes downcast, his muttering barely audible. Jurors shifted uneasily in their seats, glancing at one another as if to ask, was this really the man prosecutors claimed controlled the most powerful mafia family in America? The Oddfather persona had followed him inside, and once again, the trial became less about crimes and more about whether Vincent Gigante was even capable of standing trial at all. On one side of the courtroom, prosecutors brought their arsenal: wiretaps, transcripts, informants, photos of soldiers bowing their heads when Chin entered the room. They played tapes where Vincent's voice was crisp and commanding, his orders sharp, his authority undeniable. They painted a picture of a man running a multi-billion-dollar criminal enterprise, orchestrating gambling rackets, construction scams, loan sharking operations, and murder conspiracies with the discipline of a corporate executive. On the other side, defense attorneys wheeled in doctors, stacks of medical files, and psychiatric evaluations that read like case studies in madness. Schizophrenia, paranoid delusions, dementia. The reports were endless, signed by respected psychiatrists who swore under oath that Vincent Gigante was incapable of even comprehending the charges against him. To them, the muttering wasn't an act. It was the symptom of a broken mind. They spoke clinically, describing his supposed disorientation, his inability to grasp reality, his childlike dependence on others. And so the courtroom battles dragged on, not over guilt or innocence, but over sanity and deception. Judges listened, often torn between the mountain of evidence and the sight of the frail man slouched before them. Jurors watched, bewildered. Was this a cunning mastermind or a tragic patient? Could a man so seemingly fragile truly be capable of controlling the most disciplined mafia family in the country? The stalling was deliberate. Every psychiatric evaluation meant another delay, another hearing, another postponement. Months stretched into years. Trials were pushed back, prosecutors' momentum stalled. Witnesses grew older, memories faded. For Vincent, time itself was a victory. Every day outside prison walls was another hand won in the long game he had mastered. The FBI agents who had spent their careers chasing him seethed in frustration. They knew the truth. They had watched him run meetings, heard his orders on tape, collected testimony from insiders who described him as sharp and calculating. Yet in the courtroom, all of that seemed to dissolve in the face of doctors insisting he was too sick to even participate in his defense. It was like watching a magician pull the same trick over and over, and still being unable to expose the illusion. The Oddfather act was so convincing that even some medical professionals found themselves doubting. Madness is a slippery thing, hard to measure, harder still to disprove. And Vincent played the part with commitment that bordered on genius. He mumbled when spoken to, stared blankly at walls, sometimes refused to leave his bed. Guards reported he seemed lost, incoherent. Each report became another page in the defense's arsenal, another weapon to stall the march of justice. But the prosecutors didn't give up. They countered with their own experts, doctors who testified that Vincent was faking, that his symptoms were too convenient, too rehearsed. They pointed to the sharpness of his voice on tape, the clarity of his business dealings, the discipline with which he maintained his family's empire. They argued that he was playing the system, manipulating the very compassion of the courts to shield himself. The battles grew almost surreal. One day, a doctor would swear Vincent was incapable of understanding a single charge. The next, a prosecutor would play a recording of him negotiating union contracts with precision. One moment, he appeared pitiful and broken. The next, witnesses testified to meetings where he was commanding and ruthless. The contradictions piled up, leaving judges trapped in limbo, unwilling to move forward without certainty. Years slipped by this way. The robe and muttering became courtroom fixtures, symbols of a man who seemed untouchable not because of violence or power, but because of absurdity. While other mafia bosses were convicted and paraded in shackles, Vincent continued to shuffle the streets of Greenwich Village, shielded by his act and his lawyers' relentless maneuvers. To the public, it became a kind of dark comedy. Headlines mocked the Oddfather. Late-night hosts cracked jokes about the mob boss who couldn't tie his own shoes, but somehow ran a billion-dollar empire. But inside FBI offices, there was no laughter. For them, each joke was a reminder of their failure, each cartoon a fresh bruise to their pride. The courtroom battles were never really about evidence. They were about time. And time was what Vincent needed most. He knew the system moved slowly, that jurors hesitated, that judges feared condemning a man who might truly be ill. He played those fears like a violin, dragging the proceedings out year after year. But even the best performances cannot last forever. Technology was advancing. Younger prosecutors were less willing to be swayed by robes and muttering. The wiretaps grew sharper, the testimony stronger, the cracks in the mask wider. The robe was fraying, the nonsense muttering less convincing in the face of Vincent's own voice on tape. For decades, he had stalled, dodged, and delayed. But by the mid-90s, the patience of the courts was thinning. The long game of deception was entering its final act. The Oddfather still muttered, still slouched, still played the role of a broken man. But the prosecutors pressing forward had begun to smell blood. And as one more delay was granted, one more evaluation filed, one more year slipped by, everyone in that courtroom knew the same truth. The performance was brilliant, but even the most brilliant performance must eventually face its curtain call. The courtroom was hushed on that June morning in 1997. Reporters filled every bench, pens poised, cameras waiting outside for the moment that had been nearly 4 decades in the making. At the defense table sat Vincent Gigante, shoulders slumped, robe-like clothes hanging loosely from his frame, lips moving in a faint mutter that drifted into the silence. For years, this performance had stalled the system, confounded prosecutors, and shielded him from justice. But this time was different. The jury had returned, and with their verdict, the long game of the Oddfather was about to end. When the foreman stood and read the word guilty, the air in the courtroom seemed to shift. For the first time, the robe had not been enough. The muttering had not swayed them. Decades of medical files, doctors' reports, and theatrical performances had crumbled in the face of wiretaps, testimony, and the sheer weight of evidence. Vincent, the Chin Gigante, the Oddfather of Greenwich Village, was convicted on racketeering and conspiracy charges. The illusion that had carried him for so long had finally been pierced. The sentence was harsh, but fitting. 12 years in federal prison, a punishment meant to mark not only his guilt, but the years of frustration he had caused law enforcement. Prosecutors stood tall, their voices sharp as they declared a victory for justice, a triumph over one of the most cunning and elusive bosses in Mafia history. FBI agents, some of whom had spent their entire careers chasing him, exhaled with relief. The headache that had haunted them for decades was over. For Vincent, the moment must have been surreal. He had played the system for so long, outlasting rivals, delaying trials, turning ridicule into armor. He had ruled from the shadows while laughing off the spotlight, convincing neighbors, journalists, even judges that he was too broken to matter. And now, the very performance that had protected him had collapsed. He wasn't being mocked anymore. He was being led away. The Oddfather nickname followed him into the headlines once more, but now it carried a different weight. It was no longer just a punchline. It was a symbol of how long he had managed to fool the world, and how, finally, the mask had slipped. Newspapers ran stories marveling at the decades-long deception. Late-night comedians cracked their jokes, but even they admitted, the Oddfather had played one of the greatest games in criminal history, and for years he had won. Inside the Genovese family, the conviction sent ripples, but not collapse. His discipline had ensured the family structure was strong, built to endure even without him at the helm. Captains continued the business, soldiers ran the rackets, and the machine kept turning. Unlike the flamboyant Gambinos, whose empire fractured after Gotti's fall, the Genovese family remained steady. That was Vincent's legacy, an empire designed to outlive its leader. Still, there was no denying the moment marked the end of an era. The robe and slippers, once symbols of untouchability, were now props in a performance that had finally failed. The man who had shuffled through the streets as a fool while ruling as a king was now just another inmate in the federal system. The muttering, once a shield, echoed only in the corridors of a prison. For law enforcement, the conviction was more than a victory. It was a lesson. Gigante had shown them that crime bosses didn't have to flaunt power to hold it. He had revealed the strength of invisibility, the brilliance of patience, the cunning of silence. And though he was behind bars, his playbook would haunt investigators for years to come. As Vincent was led away, his slippers scuffing against the courthouse floor, the world finally saw the curtain fall on one of the longest performances in criminal history. The Oddfather had ruled with whispers, hidden behind nonsense, and fooled almost everyone for nearly 30 years. But in 1997, the performance ended, and the man behind the mask was left to face the reality he had spent a lifetime avoiding. Yet even in defeat, the question lingered in the air, whispered among agents and journalists alike. Had they truly broken Vincent Gigante, or had he simply chosen to let the curtain fall at last? The iron door slammed shut, and with it the world of Greenwich Village slipped away. Vincent the Chin Gigante, the Oddfather who had fooled judges, juries, and neighbors for decades, was now just another number in the federal prison system. But even inside those gray walls, among the echo of boots on concrete and the hum of fluorescent lights, Vincent clung to the act that had defined him. He shuffled through the corridors in slippers, muttering under his breath, eyes cast downward as though lost in a fog only he could see. To guards and inmates alike, it looked as if the Oddfather persona had followed him to prison. But behind the act, the reality was harder to maintain. The prison system was not like the streets of Greenwich Village, where neighbors laughed and pitted, or courtrooms where jurors second-guessed themselves. Inmates watched closely, guards reported everything, psychiatrists examined with sharper suspicion. The robe had been left behind, but the muttering continued, the blank stares, the long silences. At first, some believed it. Others weren't so sure. To men hardened by years behind bars, the difference between weakness and performance was easier to spot. Even so, Vincent was not treated like an ordinary inmate. His reputation preceded him, a whisper in the halls, a shadow in the yard. This was not just another prisoner. This was the boss of bosses, the quiet hand that had steered the Genovese family for decades. Other inmates showed deference, some out of respect, others out of fear. For all the muttering and shuffling, everyone knew his influence stretched far beyond the prison walls. Soldiers still operated on the outside. The Genovese family still moved money and power, and in many ways Vincent still ruled, though now his throne was a cell. The FBI and prosecutors watched closely, determined to see if the act would hold in confinement. For years they had endured his performance, but prisons stripped away the theater of the streets. They wanted proof that the Oddfather mask was nothing more than deception. Slowly they gathered it. Guards reported moments when Vincent was clear, sharp, attentive. Fellow inmates spoke quietly of times he dropped the act, when he gave advice or made remarks that revealed a lucid mind. Doctors noted inconsistencies, symptoms that came and went, behaviors that seemed rehearsed rather than natural. The walls were closing in, and the act that had shielded him for so long began to fray. In prison, time was no longer an ally, but an enemy. Years passed slowly, each day a reminder that the long game of deception had reached its limits. The robe could no longer protect him. The muttering no longer stalled trials. He was serving his sentence, and no performance could change that. Yet still, Vincent held on. It was almost as if the Oddfather persona had fused with the man himself, no longer just a mask, but a second skin. After decades of shuffling and muttering, after years of convincing the world of his madness, perhaps even he blurred the line between act and reality. Was he still performing, or had the performance consumed him? That was the question that haunted both guards and prosecutors alike. Inside those gray walls, he remained a paradox. To some, he was pitiable, a broken man muttering to himself in the corner of the yard. To others, he was still the quiet Don, commanding respect without raising his voice, ruling invisibly through loyalty and fear. And outside, in the world beyond the fences, the Genovese family endured, steady as ever, proof that his discipline had outlasted his freedom. But even legends cannot escape time. The act that had once made him untouchable now seemed hollow, a shadow of its former brilliance. The prison corridors echoed with his muttering. But this time, there was no courtroom to delay, no jury to fool, no neighbors to laugh at the sight of the Oddfather in his robe. There were only walls, steel doors, and the relentless tick of time. And as the years stretched on, Vincent Gigante, the man who had turned madness into armor, found himself facing the one truth no act could disguise. Even the Oddfather could not shuffle forever. The news broke quietly at first, just a whisper in court filings in the summer of 2003. After decades of muttering in robes, after years of psychiatrists testifying on his behalf, after nearly half a lifetime of outsmarting prosecutors, Vincent the Chin Gigante finally admitted what the FBI had always claimed. The Oddfather had been an act. The robe, the slippers, the blank stares, the gibberish, all of it, a carefully crafted performance. In a rare moment of truth, the man who had fooled the courts for nearly 30 years confessed. He had faked insanity. The admission stunned those who had followed his story. For years, Vincent's supposed madness had been accepted as fact by many, ridiculed by some, but always debated. Judges had hesitated, juries had doubted, neighbors had laughed. Doctors had filled file after file with diagnoses of schizophrenia, paranoia, dementia, and through it all, the robe and muttering had become symbols of his untouchability. To hear him finally admit, it was like seeing the magician reveal the trick after decades of dazzling the crowd. The confession didn't come from guilt or remorse. It came from necessity. By 2003, Vincent was serving time in federal prison, his health genuinely declining. Prosecutors had pressed him relentlessly, determined to cut through the last remnants of the illusion. His lawyers, faced with mounting evidence and fewer avenues of delay, struck a deal. In exchange for concessions on his prison conditions and sentencing matters, Vincent admitted under oath that he had feigned mental illness to avoid prosecution. For the FBI and federal prosecutors, it was vindication. After decades of frustration, of watching trials stall and cases collapse, they finally had what they had always known in their gut: proof that the Oddfather persona had been a fraud. Agents who had retired heard the news and shook their heads with a mixture of satisfaction and disbelief. They had spent entire careers chasing him, swearing he was sane, and now the man himself had said the words. But the confession also carried something more, a sense of dark admiration. For all the fury he had caused law enforcement, for all the delays and humiliations, there was no denying the brilliance of the act. Vincent Gigante had done what no other mob boss had ever managed. He had turned ridicule into armor, laughter into a shield, nonsense into strategy. For nearly 3 decades, he had ruled the Genovese family while convincing the courts he was unfit to stand trial. His act had outlasted presidents, prosecutors, and rival dons. It was, in its way, the most successful con of his criminal career. The public responded with a mixture of amusement and shock. Headlines splashed the confession across the country. Oddfather admits it was all an act. Late-night comedians revisited their old jokes with new punchlines, marveling that the robe and muttering had fooled not just neighbors, but doctors, judges, and juries. For many, it was confirmation of what they had always suspected. For others, it was a revelation, proof that the line between madness and cunning could blur in the most unexpected ways. Inside the Mafia world, the confession changed little. By then, Vincent's power had waned, his influence fading with his health. The Genovese family endured, still disciplined, still profitable, its structure built to survive the fall of any boss. But among mobsters, the Oddfather legend grew. To admit the act had been fake was to cement it as one of the most audacious gambits in Mafia history. Few could rival the patience, the discipline, the sheer commitment required to maintain a performance for so long. Yet for Vincent himself, the confession marked the end of the long game. The robe was gone. The muttering no longer mattered. The courts, the doctors, the juries, none of it could protect him now. He was in prison, his health failing, his secrets laid bare. The performance that had once defined him had finally ended, stripped away by his own words. Still, one question lingered, whispered among agents, reporters, even ordinary people who had watched his story unfold. Did he admit the truth only because he had no choice? Or did the Oddfather, after decades of deception, want to leave the world with one final twist, to remind everyone that while they had laughed at him, he had been laughing at them all along? In 2003, the curtain fell. The robe and slippers were revealed as props. The muttering, a script. And Vincent Gigante, the man who had convinced the world he was insane, finally told the truth. He had been the sharpest actor in the history of organized crime. The prison corridors had grown quieter for Vincent Gigante in his final years. Gone were the tense courtroom battles. Gone was the shuffling act that once mocked prosecutors. By 2005, he was simply another aging inmate, 77 years old, frail, and fading. The Oddfather who had outwitted the system for decades now found himself outmatched by time itself. His health had been declining for years. Heart problems, physical weakness, and the relentless toll of age left him a shadow of the man who once commanded the Genovese family from behind a curtain of muttering nonsense. In prison, there was no robe to hide behind, no jury to fool. Guards and doctors saw the reality of a body failing, even if the act still lingered in flashes. For Vincent, who had built a life on patience and deception, this final chapter was one he could not delay. Despite his failing health, he still carried the aura of his reputation. Inmates whispered about who he had been, the boss who fooled everyone, the Oddfather who turned madness into armor. Guards treated him with a mix of pity and wary respect. But the truth was undeniable. His power was gone, his empire left to others, his influence reduced to memories. The Genovese family endured, as he had designed it to. But Vincent himself was just another prisoner counting down days. On December 19, 2005, Vincent Gigante died in the medical wing of the federal prison in Springfield, Missouri. The cause was heart disease, the same ailment that had plagued him for years. He was 77. News of his death spread quickly, and once again his name filled headlines. Some remembered him as a ruthless Don, others as the Oddfather who shuffled through the village in a robe. To many, he was both, the cunning boss and the absurd figure who fooled the world. The FBI issued statements of vindication, noting that one of their most frustrating adversaries had finally reached his end. Reporters revisited his life story, marveling at the decades of deception. Comedians recycled their jokes one last time. And in the underworld, his death was marked quietly, with the kind of muted respect reserved for a man who had ruled not by volume, but by silence. Vincent Gigante's death closed the book on one of the strangest sagas in American organized crime. He had been feared, mocked, underestimated, admired, and despised. He had been the robe-wearing ghost of Greenwich Village and the calculating Don behind the curtain. And in the end, he died not on the streets or in a hail of bullets, but in a prison hospital bed, proof that even the Oddfather could not escape time. Yet his legend lived on. For every neighbor who remembered the muttering man in slippers, for every agent who spent a career chasing him, for every mobster who studied his discipline, the story of Vincent, the Chin Gigante, remained unforgettable. He was the Don who laughed at the system and, for decades, made the system laugh at itself. And when the curtain finally fell in 2005, the audience was left with a single, haunting question. Had the Oddfather been performing to the very end, or had the act finally consumed the man himself? The robe, the slippers, the muttering strolls through Greenwich Village. For decades, they defined Vincent, the Chin Gigante, in the public eye. To neighbors, he was a tragic eccentric. To comedians, he was an easy punchline. To law enforcement, he was a maddening puzzle. But when history looks back, his story is not about comedy or pity. It is about one of the most cunning deceptions in organized crime history. The Oddfather's legacy is not just that he led the Genovese family at its height. It is that he did so while convincing the world he was incapable of even tying his own shoes. In the annals of the Mafia, many names stand out. Lucky Luciano, the architect of the commission. Carlo Gambino, the quiet strategist who built his family into a powerhouse. John Gotti, the dapper Don who ruled the tabloids as much as the streets. But Vincent Gigante carved a place of his own, not by seeking the spotlight, but by vanishing in his shadows so convincing that even his enemies doubted themselves. His deception was not measured in weeks or months, but in decades. Few criminal figures in history have managed such a sustained performance. The genius of Gigante's strategy was its simplicity. Most mobsters sought respect through fear, intimidation, or ostentatious displays of wealth. Vincent sought survival through ridicule. By making himself look ridiculous, wandering in robes, mumbling nonsense, he turned himself into the least likely figure of power. Who would believe that the robe-wearing fool on Sullivan Street was running the most disciplined crime family in America? The absurdity became his shield, and the longer he wore it, the stronger it became. Law enforcement's frustration only deepened his legend. For years, FBI agents watched him walk the streets in pajamas while hearing whispers of his absolute authority inside the Genovese family. Trials stalled again and again. Doctors swore he was unfit. Juries hesitated. Judges delayed. He became the embodiment of the system's limits, the reminder that justice is not only about evidence, but about perception. His robe turned into a weapon sharper than a blade, a defense more effective than any lawyer's argument. Yet his legacy is not only about deception, it is also about discipline. Under his leadership, the Genovese family thrived. They avoided the chaos that consumed other mafia clans. They stayed quiet, avoided headlines, and kept their machine running smoothly. His insistence on silence, on invisibility, made his organization the most enduring of them all. Even after his imprisonment, the family continued to operate with the same discipline he had instilled. Unlike the flamboyance of the Gambinos, the Genovese dynasty endured through the steady, invisible hand of Vincent Gigante. But deception, no matter how brilliant, cannot last forever. In 2003, the curtain slipped when he finally admitted that his madness had been an act all along. By then, his health was failing, his power waning, but the truth cemented his legend. He had fooled psychiatrists, neighbors, the media, even seasoned prosecutors. For nearly 30 years, he had convinced the world of a lie, and ruled in plain sight because of it. So was Vincent Gigante the most cunning mafia boss of the modern age? Many would argue yes. His empire was vast, his discipline unmatched, and his survival extraordinary. He outlasted rivals, eluded prosecutors, and built a legacy not just of crime, but of audacity. His story is not simply about the mafia. It is about illusion, about the power of perception, about how laughter itself can be a weapon. In the end, the Oddfather died in prison, a frail old man stripped of his robe and slippers. But his legend remained, whispered in law enforcement offices, in mafia lore, in the pages of true crime history. He was the Don who played the fool, the king who disguised himself as a beggar, the actor who blurred the line between performance and reality until even he seemed swallowed by the role. Vincent, the Chin, Gigante's legacy is this. In the theater of organized crime, he staged the ultimate deception. And for decades, the world applauded without ever realizing they were